So the deal today is an opportunity to make a research presentation with question and answer. And the idea is to give you the practice among friends on the presentation skills. So what we'll be doing is, as I said, we'll have 10 minutes for the presentation, have 5 minutes for question and answer, and let me encourage you all to have a question prepared. We may not get to everybody having a question, but you need, as Penny said at class last time, it takes some thought and preparation to be a good questioner. And this is not necessarily to catch people or to grill people, but to engage with the presenter on the topic. So try to have some interesting and engaging question that you might expand the value of the presentation. Following that, you guys we'll all be making some notes, so Chris don't get distracted by that. It's just so we don't forget what we want to say to you. Or we may be scribbling our question. And after the Q&A, we will have a chance for people to provide feedback. And that feedback will be on the presentation itself, how it went, on the slides, give some suggestions if any, or affirmations, and then on the Q&A. So those are the 3 things that we will talk about in 5 minutes afterwards. So 10 minutes presentation, 5 minutes Q&A, and another 5 minutes to really give feedback. Does that sound okay? Everybody has some forms that we use, and you just give those to the presenter or email them or hand them in next week when you guys come from the Kannapolis site. So we'll all be together next week. All right, any questions?
Are you going to cut us off right at 10 minutes, or?
We'll give you a feedback on time. We're not going to pull the hook out and, but we'll say you were 11 minutes.
Okay.
Again, just a notation that, how close you came to that. So no, we're not going to, I have been at meetings that, like to pull the plug, but there are not too many of those. But what you need to do is try to be respectful for the time, because somebody's going to be trying to keep the meeting on time. All right, anything else?
Mm-hmm.
Scott, you good? He's on silent.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Do you have a pen I can borrow?
Did you not come prepared?
I have a green
Two
one.
pairs for that. Yes, I do. I have.
I'm all electronic these days.
I know. Yeah, same. I never carry paper.
Always
or anything.
shocking when I
And I
require
can't,
a pen.
Southerners can't say the difference between pen and pen.
Well, can you tell it's mine? Because that's always the dead giveaway for
Don't they
people.
say pin?
Yeah.
Pen. She did it. I didn't even catch it.
Oh, I didn't catch it
Yeah,
either.
right.
I was
Pin,
like,
pin, and pin.
That's how I talk.
It's all the same
How
to
do you say
me.
the one with the lead in it? What do you call it?
Yeah, that one.
What do you call
Pencil.
it?
Yep.
Pencil.
Pencil.
Yeah, I also
Pencil,
call it
pencil.
pencil.
I'm going to be a timekeeper just for information.
Okay. This is a 12-minute talk, so it's going to be a little over. I apologize. I'll
Well,
speak.
you've already prepared us
That's an old presentation. But should we be talking as if no one knows this and it's a talk and
Yes.
our next speaker
Okay.
is Dr. Christopher Nicholas. He's presenting Mapping the Food Environment in San Cristobal, Galapagos. Dr. Nicholas.
Thank you everyone for having me. As mentioned, my name is Christopher Nicholas. I'm a PhD. Apparently, I have my PhD in nutrition at UNC Chapel Hill. And the one thing I'll note about this project and my collaborators here are from a broad range of fields, from geography and medicine to nutrition and anthropology, and a lot of the approach and methods that we take reflects that. Okay, so first, what I want to talk about is outline a bit what I'll talk about today. And first, I'll give you a bit of background. So what is a food environment? Where is the Galapagos Islands? Why do we research there? And the specific approach we're taking, what data we're using, the methods that we're using, the spatial methods and the data collection methods we're using. And then I'll talk to you about the results and then the future directions I will take using these data. So the first question inevitably we always get is question of do people live there? Aren't the Galapagos Islands just iguanas and sea lions? But the people do indeed live there. The population of the Galapagos Islands is 27,000, and it's located 1,000 kilometers away from mainland Ecuador. So its residents is composed of Ecuadorians who've been migrating there largely from the 60s and 70s, with the population dwindling down. And the island we're working in particular, this highlighted one, is San Cristobal, and that island is the capital and has a population of about 5,000. And towards the end, I'll tell you a bit about the other islands that we're working in and we'll be collecting data in. But for now, we're talking about this main island here. And for context, the diameter to walk from one end to the other, we're looking at about like a 40-minute leisurely walk. So it's large enough for geography and space to matter, but small enough where the isolation is important. And we'll come back to some of those themes throughout. So first, food environment is a very broad, multidimensional term. So I'm going to talk about some of the elements that define the food environment. And one thing I should note before I move on actually is I'll just say, if the clicker work, is that the Galapagos Islands are 98% national forest land. So there's very limited food production that can be had on the island. And this is important because the markets, the local markets, the tiendas, are where the majority, virtually all of the food that local residents and tourists alike eat. So this is an example here when we say a market, they're really small, and produce is sold there, fruits, vegetables, frozen meat, most of it imported foods. And because of the isolation being located 1,000 kilometers away, and because there's not a lot of local production, almost all of the fruits and vegetables are imported, and you can imagine either it comes 1,000 kilometers by boat, so it takes a long time and might spoil by the time it's there, or it comes by plane, in which case it's more expensive. As I mentioned, lacking in local production, so the fruits and vegetables that are imported constitute the majority of the foods consumed. And then seasonality. Because food is imported, in addition to seasonality being an effect on the mainland, and when we think of agriculture in general, it's especially a problem when we think of having to bring food 1,000 kilometers in, and what does that mean for when it's available, what quality it's in, and more generally, what types of foods are available, especially related to fruits and vegetables. And this is all separate from the idea of preferences, where people go, why they go there, the decisions they make around what foods to eat, and especially in the Latin American context, when we think of the dual burden of health, the rising incidence, prevalence of obesity and overweight, alongside things like anemia or iron deficient anemia. Okay, so that's some of the context for the Galapagos food environment. And for the research question, just to situate this presentation in larger context, loosely related to the aims of this project, but these are the three primary research questions. First is a spatial focused research question. How do food environments change over space and time? The second is how do households interact with these environments? So this latter part is thinking a lot about how does the environment affect household decision making, and is the food environment in any way indicative of health outcomes and diet? And the last bit is some qualitative research that I'm working on with focus groups to assess community perceptions around potential interventions on the island. But for this talk, I'll focus specifically on the first part of the first research question, which is how do food environments change over space? Not yet time, we have time series data we're collecting every summer, but for here I'll talk to you just about space. So the data. The data we're using stems from a survey, the Nutrition Environment Measurement Survey for Stores, the really well-known survey that has taken on different dimensions, different iterations developed by Karen Glantz and her lab. And the idea is simple. Every market, every store is assigned a score. And the score is a function of you get more points for healthier foods and more of them, and you get less points for more unhealthy foods. This has been used throughout Latin America in different contexts. And as mentioned, we're sampling these markets at different time points so that we can assess how the food environment changes over time. And here's an example of what, in the Brazilian context, and we adapted the survey to reflect Ecuadorian foods, what this looks like. So you can imagine for fruits, you get more points for increased availability of foods, and you have more points for increased quality, and quality is assessed by the interviewer in the markets. And then you can see you have less points for things like white bread and instant noodles, cookies, those sorts of things. So this constitutes the market. And this is Becky and I in the first market two summers ago when we got the first wave of data collection. Okay, this is a map here of San Cristobal, and it is every point represents, every dot you see in the map represents a market, and the color corresponds to the market score. So it's a very basic depiction of what we see. And one thing to note is that negative scores are possible, and what this means is that this particular market has more unhealthy, more processed foods, and perhaps none or very limited selection of fruits and vegetables. Just by looking at this, prior to any statistical calculations or spatial methods, what we see are two main things. First is a clustering of low NEM scores, nutritional environment measurement scores, nearest to the coast, that's in the north. And then, and this is what we would expect, given that this is where a lot of the tourists live, a lot of the hotels and hostels. So tourists are more concerned with wine and chocolate and snacks and less concerned with fruits and vegetables. And yet local residents do indeed shop there. So this is indicative of the food environment in that area. And interestingly, a high NEM score near the municipal market, and I'll show you where that is in a later slide, but it's this conglomeration of those red points there. And I've told Natalia the story at least 5 times by now, but the reason this is important is an example of chirimoya, which is a delicious, wonderful, sweet fruit. And I had it with my host family in the Highlands, and I really wanted more of it, and I asked them where I can get it. They told me I can get it in any market. And I tried up north by the Galapagos Science Center. I had tried everywhere, and I couldn't find it. But then someone told me to go to the municipal market, which is a 2-story indoor-outdoor market where vendors sell all fruits and vegetables, and all of them, most of them locally imported, but some local production. And on Tuesday, they brought it in and they had the chirimoya. And then, importantly, all of the markets around the municipal market, all the smaller markets, tiendas, also had the fruit. So it's some suggestion of an underlying spatial variance that determines the food environment there that we'll see borne out in the later steps. So these are the data, these are the market scores. And so back to the original research question. So we want to know, how do food environments vary across space? And there are a lot of different ways that have been used in the literature to assess this, ranging from picking a point and drawing a buffer around that point and seeing what the types of markets that are there. And what hasn't been done that we're proposing to try here, and we have done, is what's called spatial interpolation, which is a simple way just to say you start out with point data, which is represented here by the markets. Every market has a score, and then you apply statistical methods to obtain a continuous surface or a map of the food environment. And I'll note the reason this works in this context is because spatial interpolation is used for things like particulate matter in the air or arsenic, where you can imagine you can't sample every point, but certain select sample points might provide you a distribution. And that works in this really interesting case in the Galapagos because we have sampled every single market, which is a totality of the food environment, because there are the markets are the sole source of food. And I can talk a bit more about the specific type of interpolation we use here, but what I'll do is math. Okay, so the premise of this is the algorithm that we developed, and it's simply, I'll go through the individual parts, but if you remember nothing else, remember that food environments are a function of quality and access. This is a generally formalized idea in the literature that we are trying to conceptualize practically here. So what we have here is the food environment at the estimation point. Consider an estimation point like a pixel in a map. You want to know what is the food environment at this point. And that is simply a function of 2 things, quality and access. So first, quality. This is the score at that pixel, the continuous surface that's derived from spatial interpolation. But you can imagine that's not enough to account for the food environment because things like access have to be conceptualized. So how we've done that is simply 2 parts. This is simply a distance k function. The idea that as you go farther from a point, the relevance of that point to your reality dwindles. So for food environments, the farther you go, the less that market score has. So this is a distance decay function with different parameters. And then importantly, we sum that for every market in the area. So you have a comprehensive access measure combined with a food quality score, which combined give you what we propose is a food environment score for that point. Okay, so again, here we have the main area we're working in, San Cristobal. And here again, we have the mapped market scores, the mapped points. And I'm bringing it down real quickly. And here is the access measure. So this is not the spatial interpolation. Again, this is just the sum distance from every pixel you see on this map to all the markets. So the red areas, think of it as a heat map, hot and cold. The red areas mean that there's a density of markets around there. And sure enough, at the municipal market, there are many other markets. And then the bluer areas mean that there's a dearth of markets. And then this is the EBK, this is the spatial interpolation map. So this does not consider access. This is just the scores over distance or over the map, and we want to see a continuous surface of the areas And we see lower near the coast as expected and higher near the market and elsewhere. But it's this final map that we're really interested in because it considers access, a measure of distance, as well as the quality scores. And we can see really lower scores towards the highlands, away from the more populated areas where most of the local residents live, and high scores near the hospital. And just to wrap up here, so the main key findings is that the food environment is not spatially invariant. There is some geographic underlying function that might determine what people are exposed to in their environments, and we see so especially near the municipal market and near the hospital. That's in the top right corner, which actually looks like a turtle. They designed it so it looks like a turtle. You see in the top right, it's really cool. But anyway, and then so those are the low scoring areas. And then interesting, we see a cluster of good but not bad markets. So we have a lot of red areas where markets, especially near the municipal market, where there's a lot of produce, but we don't see a lot of areas of, besides near the coast, of a lot of poor market scores. And so quickly, the next steps, we're going to analyze the temporal changes, household interactions, thinking of what does this mean for households? This is just an environmental measure, but how do households interact with this space? What does that mean for their diet? That's what we're doing next. And then this past summer, we did a similar study in Isabella Island, a smaller island, and then we're hopefully, depending on some grants, going to do that this coming summer, so to have a geographic idea, and then the qualitative stuff. And finally, some thanks to our collaborators, institutional and research collaborators, and our funding through Dr. Thompson's NIHR 21 and some other research grants. Thank you.
Okay, that was just about, thank you very much. We will open this paper up for questions. I'll start us off. I was a little bit confused about access, the definition of access. It looked like it was on variety. How was access defined or measured?
Access, when you think of the map of access?
Well, whatever you set up for access, you were measuring the amount of different, the variety of fruits and vegetables. That's how they got there was a score there on
I see what you're saying.
different variety. I thought that was what you were talking about access. How do you define access? How's it measured?
So access, the one that you're talking about in this here, availability, is simply what's available and not so much access.
But not then quantity. So you're only doing variety as a measure of availability.
Variety of those the types, if there are bananas and apples and so on and so forth, and then the quality of those, but not if you're asking about access in the geographic sense, that's
okay. I should have said availability.
Okay.
So, but nothing in quantity.
Nothing in quantity.
That doesn't matter.
Given the generally homogeneous size of the markets and how, as you saw in the picture, there was one side with vegetables, and that's really indicative of how the markets go. So we think that's less.
Except for the central market.
Yeah, except for the central market, which is only open on some days, so it's not. It's a hub for where people gather and around which it might matter for other markets, but less so for.
So I was confused about what was the difference between the possible and the actual scores that you presented in the map, and if you can explain a little more. When you talk about the markets
Yes.
here. Like,
that's just to say that there is by virtue of the scale, you could theoretically have negative 41 or up to positive 73,
okay.
but in practice we saw minus 13 up to positive 37.
Do you mind just going ahead, clicking ahead to your first spatial map?
You guys shouldn't use this, it's not very great. The access one.
Yeah, so this access one looks almost identical to the one that you said was so much better. So what, is there really an improvement?
Yeah, that's a good question. The depiction of it in map form is simply a function of the scale that we choose to represent it by and how we break up the quantiles. But if you note the numbers, a high of 153, 6 represents you live in a really central area with a lot of markets, so whatever your quality score is increased upwards by a factor of 6. And that's really significant when we consider the actual food quality score and what a number like 26 means, the different ways to get to 26. So we think of a 26 multiplied by a 6 and you get to a 153, then we really start to have different bearings. But the distribution, you're quite right, is similar. But in our application of when we look at the household interaction, and this is a determinant or an exposure in different relationships, then these values are going to be what's I think most salient.
But they still all seem to say the same thing, but just different number values.
I think by all, if you mean access and the finalized score, yes, but that is a function of we easily could have chosen different numbers and to make this look redder and bluer, but I think we chose the most parsimonious way to show them and maintain the scales as much as possible in distribution that they represent. But neither the access nor the quality score independently represent the underlying food environment, at least is what we believe. So the combination thereof is what leads to this, and the representation of how that looks, I don't think has bearing on the underlying data and what each pixel, each number represents.
Somewhere, I guess, in this analysis, but maybe I couldn't quite follow, is related to where people live. So you geocoded addresses?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the beginning, the 3 research questions, this is the purely environmental focused one. But as part of our data collection, we're in households and we get as much as can be possible in a population of 5,000, geographically representative area of the different neighborhoods and the different census blocks. So we're in all the different areas, and let's go back to this map here so it's just clear. And what we do in every household is, we have a geocoded, we have the address, the latitude and longitude, and we have diet intake, health status, interprometry, biomarkers, food security scales, and all of these will be the things that will then link.
But that wasn't in these data.
No, this is
But you had a variable that was something about dwindling value, which had some sort of an assumption about what made it dwindle.
Was it the distance decay?
Distance, like, is that from market to market?
So this is purely, so first thing to remind you is that all these data use the market scores, the market survey. So no household data went into any of this. And so when we say dwindling value, to pick a point in the map, so let's start here.
I think the question is, what's your origin that you're using for the distance decay?
The estimation point, and that's what I'm trying to, the estimation point is a pixel in a map. So for every single point along this map, to go from here to here, what you're taking is that given pixel, and you're saying, how far is that pixel from, in the case of access, we're just looking at distance, from every market when applied to the distance decay function, with the idea that across increasing distance you'll have, and that's what the different parameters mean, so we can.
Yeah, I guess I don't understand the meaning of a pixel. I mean, I understand the definition.
I think he's just looking at market to market distances and how far they are from each other.
Okay, so
Or is the assumption that all of the food comes from the municipal market to all of the others? Is that why you're doing market to market?
No, it's not market to market, it's point to market to get this map and to get an access score, you can see at the end here, there are little pixels. Every one of those pixels has a score that we map. And so basically this equation is.
Well, that's an assumption that a pixel has meaning.
No, that's geographic analysis in the sense of we know that there's underlying value, and to capture that, we are summing the distance from that pixel to all markets. So that's why here, where there's so many markets around this one particular area, that's why it's redder, because there's a lot of.
So typically when you do a distance decay, you're looking at, like, the reason I jumped to the municipal market, and I think what's confusing you is that typically you care about the distance from a person or the distance from a
source or
landmark.
something. Yeah.
So like if you were doing the distance decay, like how much food from the municipal market reaches the other ones, or if
Right.
you're doing it from a person, how far are the markets from an individual person?
Right.
So the origin points are unclear in the distance decay, because it seems like what you're saying is you're just picking a random pixel and then taking a distance from the random pixel to everything else. So the random pixel doesn't have any salience other than it's just a random pixel.
It's not a random pixel, it's every pixel that constitutes this map. And the environmental sciences and spatial interpolation, environmental exposures, this is the way to map those exposures when you have a lot of points, let's say the groundwater sampling points.
Right, but to the groundwater sampling points, you'd always do your interpolation from the origin of the pollutant or the origin of the person who's being exposed or the place that's being exposed. So even when you do like the air pollution maps like this, like Mark Sayre's maps, they're not like typically just a generic distance. They're like a reason for a distance.
Mark Sayre's actually one of the collaborators who work with me on
I know,
this.
but that's what it,
And we picked, I messed up. We picked this approach because it's not, that's distance decay in some, in an idea where there's some underlying point source and you want to measure the value here with respect to that. But here is distance decay in the sense of every point has a value. In order to get to that, there are many point sources, all of them being the various markets. So there are many point sources in that sense. So we want to depict what it look like here, but it's what spatial interpolation is in the most generic, broadest sense.
so your whole presentation right now is really just creating a surface map.
Yeah.
And so it's just a surface map, a generic surface map.
I would disagree with that characterization of it in that it's not this, the spatial approaches to taking to conceptualize food environments is lacking in literature, and we think it's really important. So this will be the preface to all future research, the health outcomes in the households. And
Right, but when you put the health outcomes on it is when you can ask the questions. This is just the generic background.
this is the research question: how do food environments vary across space? Yeah, just that first part. And
Well, I think yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll probably close on this. It's a very fruitful discussion, lots of questions, lots of answers. So we thank you very much for your presentation. Okay. All right, I'm sorry I didn't make a time. I should have done it. You were 12 and a half minutes for the presentation, but I didn't do the Q&A, and I apologize. I got too interested in the topic. Okay. So let's give some feedback to Nicholas on the presentation. So we're talking about organization, clarity, public speaking skills, quality of slides, ability to handle the questions, keep to the allotted time, not too good, and then overall. All right, comments on folks about the slides themselves, the presentation, organization, clarity.
I thought it was really high quality and I really liked the slides. I thought they were simple, but they were like, they were attractive. And I thought that like the speaking style was very good as well. I think overall it was a great presentation. I think the only thing is finding a way to explain those concepts that Penny and Diane were asking about. And because you obviously understand them, but like they are based on complex mathematical equations. So it's just like finding a way to easily explain them, I think could be really helpful. But other than that, good job.
Yeah, and I agree with Daria, but about the organization, like I wouldn't go back to the research question once you started. Like, I don't know, it was weird for me that you presented the research question, then you go back to the methods and then the research question. So maybe like introduce the methods and do that. And when you introduced your slides, you said you were going to talk about food environments. I imagine was going to be like about the definition, not about the food environment in the Galapagos, but that might be just me.
Does South Africa have anything to say?
Julie, is this?
It was a little bit hard for me to listen. Probably it's the fact that, of course, I'm in a video conference, but it would be helpful to speak a little bit loud because it was hard for me to follow up.
You couldn't hear?
It was, some parts were more complicated for me to hear.
Just complicated.
Yeah, I think Chris is a fast talker, which
Yeah.
I understand because it's a 10-minute presentation. You're trying to get through everything, but yeah.
Julie?
It was loud enough for me, but I have headphones in, so that might have helped the volume from my end. But as far as getting within a time slot, you spent a lot of time talking about the context of where the Galapagos are, and while that's really interesting for someone who likes geography, in a scientific talk, that probably doesn't need to be probably 2.5 minutes of your talk. So consider cutting that down to 15-second, here it is, let's move on, and then focus on the science.
One thing I thought would be interesting if you gave this talk or when you do something else and you talk about the 27,000 people or the 5,000 people is to actually give like say that's as big as some known, you know, I'm not sure what everybody might know, but some city, maybe where you're giving your talk, you might say this is as big as, you know, I'm trying to think what might be that big, but, you know, not that small. And then $5,000 people is obviously quite small, you know, in terms of just getting people a perspective. Because I think, I don't know, that the ignorant ones of us think about Galapagos, we think about turtles, you know, with this sort of, well, these are more like aside questions I'm curious about, like what do people do there? These are the people who work in the markets, or what do the people do who live on the Galapagos? They work in the science center. Why are they living there?
So I think you have a great, like, you're really personable and smiley, and your slides were beautiful. I think you have a lot of them though. Like I think for a talk, like a 10-minute talk, you got to get to the point. And you started by showing us like that figure that, you know, I think when people go to hear a talk and they see a figure, they think it's like a conceptual figure or relational figure, but you just were saying stuff about the environment with the environment in the middle. And I think you could do a lot more to tighten the talk in terms of what you're after. You told us like at the beginning you had a generic intro methods. Like instead of doing that, I would say, I'm going to tell you about how to make a surface map in order to understand the relationship from stores to stores. And then, you know, I'm using this innovative method of a spatial interpolation so that it's very tied to what you're going to do. You gave us all of these research questions, and then you only are answering half of the first one. And so there's no reason to tell us all the other stuff. So if you can hone it really and go much more in detail to explain what you built up to those relational maps, but you didn't really tell us what to look for, how to find something, what the meaning would be. And the next step would be to layer on the households or to ask these other questions. And so to come at the end for the future directions, I forget what you said, but to come back to these questions and say, using this map, if I then introduce people and households to this, I can then answer how they change over time and how the households interact. And you know what I mean? So you could be more, it could be more of a, it's more of a narrative, you know, so a lot of these talks do best when you really tell people. I mean, it's so stupid, but you tell them what you're going to tell them.
And then you tell them,
and then you tell them what
you told them. Exactly right. The other thing is, and probably it makes it harder in this classroom kind of format, so it's understandable. You know, we've been doing these research things, and you've tied to the research questions, and you're sort of trying to link those, so it's understandable that it could throw you off. My guess is you may make, well, you said this presentation has been made, but it might be something that is made at an environmental, planning, or something, but you're making it in a bigger context, and it would make it easier for you to zero in on this particular question. And I don't know whether other people felt the same way, and maybe people who were in the field will be very interested to look at your formula. But I think most people, it was a distraction. It was, we were, those of us that are amateurs or accept the fact that we don't know how to do it, but the formula just didn't add anything. It didn't. Complexity was already conveyed. You don't need to convey the complexity, because there was no. People can't absorb, I don't think, a formula like that. So felt like that was a waste of slide for you. So, but I think Penny's right. You do have a lovely, charismatic personality. So you make people drawn to what you say, which is a very good attribute to have. And everybody doesn't have that. So it's a very good one. So what you want to do is when you draw them in, like she said, tighten it up so you really give them the message that you want them to have. And that was, I think, a lot about this innovative methodology to establish the locales, because we need to then see what does that mean to the health of the people that we're interested in.
I'm going to add one more thing
Okay.
because I can't shut up.
It's what they pay us for.
You need to turn the charm on with the aggressive questioner. So don't, like, you fought me. You know what I mean? Like you engaged the angry question.
It was hard not to, because I feel
Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. So what you should have said, if we replay
Oh, if
it.
Barry Popkin were here, you would love to see the exchange that he would do.
Yeah, no. So what you should do in something like that is just say, you are like, not exactly like you are so right, but that is such a good point.
Yeah,
A distance decay is actually usually from a person to another thing.
But here you're
I'm
doing-
using a really novel thing. So, you
You turn it
pointed
around.
out this great thing, but no, what we're really doing is,
It's like a positivity sandwich.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
yes, but.
And that's that is a talent to do that.
It is a talent, and it's hard when it's hard,
When you
very
love your
hard in the
work, too.
moment.
Yeah.
But just try to take a deep breath and then just say, just think, how can I diffuse the situation? Don't get up there and argue with somebody. It never works out well. Cause you know what I mean? Like, either you're going to make them look bad and they're going to get more angry at you, or you're going to feel frazzled.
And it makes the audience uncomfortable.
makes the audience
even though
uncomfortable.
that person may not have been right,
Yeah.
but it makes the audience uncomfortable, and then everybody starts to feel bad, and then they take away, you don't get the acclaim that you deserved by the presentation.
And you don't have to lie and tell them that they're right when they're wrong, but you do have to kind of gently pivot it to what you're, that's a great point, but what I was actually trying to say.
Who's our next victim here? All right. Did you get your?
Oh, we have an order?
Dislodge.
Did you already?
Can you right click on that, please?
I'll just pull it out. I hope I don't lose
Yeah.
my entire life. Just on.
That would be bad. Scott, you still with us?
Chris?
Thank.
On you?
Can I just put it in there?
Yeah.
It's kind of fun.
Okay.
All right. Our next presentation will be relationships between the microbiota and diet, glycemia and adiposity in young adults with type 1 diabetes. Professor?
So, thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Daria Igudisman, and I'm a doctoral student in the Department of Nutrition at UNC Chapel Hill. And as Dr. Ward mentioned, I'll be talking to you about relationships between the gut microbiota and diet, glycemia and adiposity in young adults with type 1 diabetes. So on the agenda today is to talk about three things. First, I'll discuss challenges of co-managing glycemia and weight in type 1 diabetes. Then I'll give you an introduction into the intestinal microbiota and what exactly we mean by that term. And then I'll talk about why we would want to study the gut microbiota in the context of type 1 diabetes. I'll talk a little bit about what we know on the topic, and then I'll talk about what there is remaining to do that could potentially help us clinically when we manage type 1 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is one of the most common chronic childhood conditions, and the annual incidence has been increasing every year by 1.4% between 2001 and 2009. This is based on a US registry with 5 major centers, and this translates to about a 21% increase in the overall prevalence of type 1 diabetes between these years. So it's really difficult to manage glycemia in type 1 diabetes, as evidenced by mean A1C of 9.5% among youth with type 1 diabetes. And the recommendation from the American Diabetes Association is to maintain glycemia below 7%. So this is actually a lot higher than we would like to see. So the other problem that's actually more recent in type 1 diabetes is that we're seeing a lot of overweight and obesity, which wasn't classically the case because type 1 diabetes is catabolic if insulin is not used as a therapy, but now that insulin is widely available, we know that insulin is anabolic, it promotes energy storage, and so we're seeing that individuals with type 1 diabetes are overweight and obese at the same prevalence as the general population. We know this because we can compare it to NHANES estimates. So this is a big problem because if you're intensely treated with insulin, we know that based on the lower blue line, your risk of your cumulative incidence of cardiovascular events is reduced. But if you gain weight, as evidenced by the red line, even if you're intensively treated, you will eventually catch up in your cumulative incidence of cardiovascular risk compared with conventionally treated controls. And this was a landmark study done in 1993 in individuals with type 1 diabetes. So all of this is to say that we need novel therapies to co-manage weight and glycemia. And unfortunately, those two things are often at odds with one another because things like fear of hypoglycemia will often cause individuals with type 1 diabetes to overcorrect in order to prevent hypoglycemia. There's also an increase or reduced incentive to exercise for the same reason because of fear of hypoglycemia. And again, the anabolic nature of insulin as a hormone will promote weight gain in some people. So I'm going to pivot to the intestinal microbiota, which are the bacterial and non-bacterial flora that associate with our intestinal epithelium. And the microbiome is actually the collection of genes that belong to those microbial taxa. So today I'll be talking primarily about the gut microbiota, or the actual composition of the microbes in the intestine. And so you're probably wondering, why bother studying the intestinal microbiota in type 1 diabetes? Well, logically, you might first think about the fact that type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease, and we don't really understand the etiology of type 1 diabetes. There's been some thought that maybe the lack of epithelial integrity could cause some gut microbiota to escape the intestine and to cause an autoimmune response. This study published in 2013 showed that among very young children with type 1 diabetes, there were differences in composition of gut microbial taxa relative to healthy controls. So it's not really clear whether it's implicated in etiology, but our group is focused on managing weight and glycemia. So what can we learn about how we can potentially optimize the gut microbiota and the metabolites that they produce to potentially help co-manage weight and glycemia, which, as we know, is very challenging to do. So I want to mention that short-chain fatty acids are my primary interest with respect to the gut microbiota. They're produced by certain gut microbial taxa, which are capable of fermenting non-digestible carbohydrates, which humans can't break down, into the three primary short-chain fatty acids: acetate, butyrate, and glucosinate. We know from some animal and human studies that those three short-chain fatty acids can then travel onto the liver, to the brain, and to other organs to have metabolic effects. We also know that short-chain fatty acids are altered in the feces of individuals with type 1 diabetes relative to healthy controls. The associations aren't necessarily consistent, but generally we see a downward trend. So essentially these metabolites, which we consider to be beneficial, we see are reduced in the feces of individuals with type 1 diabetes, which is a clue that maybe if there is a way to promote their production in the intestine, perhaps that could have some beneficial effects. So we know, or my primary interest as a nutrition student is to understand better how diet can help influence the gut microbiota and perhaps downstream effects. We know that consumption of fiber increases short-chain fatty acids in the stool, but we don't know whether this relationship necessarily holds in type 1 diabetes. We also know that the gut microbiota is associated with beneficial metabolic outcomes in animals, like reduced adiposity and increased glucose tolerance. But again, we don't really know whether these relationships hold in type 1 diabetes. There has been a study where lean individuals provided stool to be transferred to obese participants at risk of metabolic syndrome, and that the insulin sensitivity of the obese participants was improved after 6 weeks of receiving the treatment, which corresponded with an increase in butyrate producing microbiota. So to wrap up, we have some clues about how the gut microbiota can influence glycemia and body fat in individuals at risk of metabolic syndrome, and in animals, we don't really know whether these relationships translate to type 1 diabetes. In our research group, we're trying to fill this gap by capitalizing on an ongoing 9-month randomized control trial in which we're testing 3 experimental diets: low carbohydrate, low fat, and Mediterranean, for co-managing A1C or glycemia and weight in type 1 diabetes. And to this study, we're adding measures of the gut microbiota. So at each 3-month interval and at baseline, we'll measure the gut microbiota and the short chain fatty acids. And the goal is essentially to see how the gut microbiota and short chain fatty acids change in response to the 3 experimental diets. Again, with the goal of exploring short chain fatty acids and short chain fatty acid producing microbiota as potential mediators of the diet glycemia and diet adiposity relationships. And so primarily we hypothesize that if there is an attenuation in the effect estimates when looking at these relationships of at least 10% or more, when including these gut microbial parameters in our models, then we would consider that to be evidence of partial mediation by the gut microbiota. So I'd like to thank my advisors, the very talented graduate students in the Carroll Lab, and I'll take any questions.
It was 8:33.
Oh, that was a lot faster than when I practiced.
All right, let's get some questions for our speaker here.
So you mentioned that some people will gain the weight, whereas do you know if some people with the same food intake and type 2 diabetes will develop weight gain and obesity, whereas others with the same food style or food intake would not? And why would that be the case? Do you think the microbiota could predispose them to be more obesogenic regardless of what they're, even if like 2 people are taking the same diet?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. That's not necessarily our primary research question, but it is a very interesting research question, because one thing I didn't mention is that short chain fatty acids are increased in the stool of obese compared to lean individuals. And I think we're really interested in knowing why that is. One hypothesis is that in this setting of excess energy with obesity, maybe there's a compensatory mechanism that causes more short chain fatty acids to be excreted or maybe not absorbed as well. But there's also the hypothesis that short chain fatty acids could result in excess energy being taken up, and so potentially it could contribute to obesity. I think, yeah, that's definitely a really interesting and unanswered question. Yeah.
So you mentioned that potential, so diabetes type 1 is an autoimmune condition, and that there's potential bacterial translocation that happens from altered gut permeability. Is it worth looking at other biomarkers of gut permeability like LPS and looking at the association of something that would indicate increased permeability that would then support maybe there is bacterial translocation versus not?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I definitely did not mean to distract from our main research question, which relates to glycemia and weight primarily. I think that is also a really interesting research question, but it's quite different from what I'm focusing on. I think that what you're proposing is definitely something interesting and valid to look at. I don't know that we're necessarily the research group who would investigate that question, because I think it involves a really sort of deep molecular approach. But I think that's a great question, yeah.
My question is similar, but more big picture related to type 1 diabetes and microbiota. My understanding of the microbiome literature, and if I'm wrong, let me know, was that a lot of the associations with gut bacteria and food intake and health are still being borne out, and the reason in animal model, let alone human models, and the potential therapeutic applications are exciting, but and even if they all kind of came to fruition tomorrow, the magnitude of what it would do for something like weight control would be it's not fully known. So I'm trying to understand, in thinking of type 1 diabetes, why the link with microbiome. Is it because there aren't many other therapeutic controls, so the magnitude of that potential therapy is magnified? I'm trying to understand why.
Yeah, so I think your question is about how important or how.
Why microbiome for type 1? You answered in the slide, but big picture, why?
Yeah, well, I think based on prior literature, particularly some of the studies which I didn't explain completely, but there are certain metabolic features of type 1 that are very unique to type 1, like increased hepatic gluconeogenesis, which is obviously unregulated because there's a lack of insulin. In animal models, short-chain fatty acids have been shown to attenuate or downregulate gluconeogenesis. So there actually are some really interesting, really specific mechanisms that could relate to type 1 diabetes. With respect to short-chain fatty acids as well, the fact that they can contribute as much as 10% of energy to the host or 10% excess energy, I think that definitely is clinically meaningful. So great question. I think there are important links.
So one other quick question, how would you tease apart, is it of interest to you to be able to tease apart the effects of the overall diets on their glycemic control versus the components of just the fatty acids?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I think the statistical approach would hopefully lend itself to teasing those relationships apart, as you said. So I think, of course, in the main trial, the main randomized control trial, we're going to be looking at glycemia as a primary outcome of the diets, and so that question is going to be answered by the study. But then so we'll analyze the gut microbiota as potential mediators of that relationship by using the data that we're collecting in addition to the main parent study. So basically, there's probably going to be an association between diet and glycemia, but then when we introduce these measures of the gut microbiota into the model, do they add anything, essentially? So.
Okay, other questions? All right, we'll thank our presenter. All right, I was able to time my 5 minutes here. Yay. Okay, all right, so let's give some feedback.
I guess the first thing I'll say is I thought that the slide that you opened with was a little hard to read and busy, and maybe just condensing. I couldn't read any of the image. It was just so that was something I thought.
Maybe put your name there.
It's a good one.
Yes, and sometimes like when we were seeing the gluconeogenesis one, you had a lot of graphs, but you didn't stop and explain. So sometimes that can be like, for me, was like trying to figure out what was in the screen more than listen. So that can be distracting.
Okay.
But
I think when you use a lot, probably any, but certainly a lot of tables from some journal article, it's really hard for us, the audience, to zero in on it because it has so much there, and you're talking and we're trying to follow what you're saying, and then we're looking at this table and it has a lot of stuff on it. You know, if you can extract, make your own, little table, just the simple part of what you, because I found it, really, really hard to follow.
So I'm going to add on top of this
that the background is not your friend with the complicated tables
Mhm.
and the number of slides. So it's not just that the table is hard,
That must
but
be.
it's just there's so much up there
Yeah.
that like I couldn't even.
You're talking about the blue and the blue over here, the design?
Yeah,
Is that what you
but no, but besides that, there's the number of slides you had.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You showed us like, I don't know how many tables in a row
Right.
with the tables had like, I don't know, maybe 40 numbers in them.
Mhm.
And so by the time that you just even honed in on something, it was you were moving to the next thing.
Mhm.
And so I very rapidly, maybe because I'm 51, very rapidly just was like, done.
Yeah.
I'm not even like I was listening to what you were saying, but
Mhm.
I actually stopped
Yeah.
trying even to read what was there.
And maybe my response, I'm gonna say a strange thing about format thing, but it may be just because what Penny said, there was just so much. Whatever your advance, however the advance, did anybody notice that the way that it must have been me, but the way your slide progression, it was almost like, I don't know whether it seemed to add to my distress.
Mhm.
I don't know. I'm the only one that saw that, so it must be
I don't
just
know what you're
me.
talking about.
Go back, Daria,
Slide
and
animation, this slide transitions.
it's a slide transition.
I didn't see anything. I think
I've
I've-
seen
What
it.
do you mean?
I don't know.
Sorry,
The way
can you flip
it didn't.
slides?
Yeah, just go change some so we can see what Diane was
It's probably
talking
me.
Oh,
You
wow.
see, that
didn't even
to me
Oh.
just I think it creates a
Oh, you want to have a seizure?
yeah, exactly.
Oh.
It creates in me a
But how, I didn't do anything to make you do that.
So there's something.
there's something in
Yeah,
there
I
that's
don't-
not the normal
You can
slide
do it.
progression.
Okay, I didn't realize that at all.
Do you see? It just
Yeah.
it creates and but it may just be people like me.
No, I mean, yeah, I didn't notice that, but I'll
Yeah.
look at, maybe it's like a setting or something.
Yeah.
So the words you were saying, the way you like, you have a very like nice way
Yeah.
of speaking. Like you don't say like you everything kind of the words you used were pretty perfect in terms of like it was almost like you were reading it. You know what I mean? Like it sounded really professional what you were saying,
Mhm.
and I could listen to what you were saying and not look at the slides.
Mhm.
So I would almost suggest that if you were to really be giving this presentation, and I do this a lot of times with people who have a hard time writing and presenting, to dictate it into just a recorder
Mhm.
and then go through it and stop and say, what is the one slide I want for this thought?
Oh, without
Yeah.
making the presentation at all?
You start with the words
Oh,
and you
interesting.
listen to it and then you put what you, so, in this 1 minute section, what are the points that I was trying to get
Mhm.
across? And because you're very good. I don't know if you were using the slides as hooks or you were just really speaking, but like what you said was great. And if you had really great
Your slides
slides
were
to go
just
along with that,
distractions. They were just a
it would
distraction.
have really
Yep, I think Penny's
been
exactly
great.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's really good feedback, thank you.
And it's almost like it's too much for the audience to take in.
Mhm.
It's almost like you had cartoons and you had, preset tables and you brought in other things that had been commercially produced, but they just made it more complex rather than, it was hard for me to actually follow the storyline.
Mhm. Because you were distracted.
Right, very
Mhm.
distraction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Kind of thing, so.
Yeah, I mean, this is just really, really minor, but I noticed while you were answering questions, you were going up and down, like your feet.
Sorry. I'm like,
It's okay.
Try not to be.
So it's a little distracting, because I started going.
You did it with your hands too.
Like this.
I'll see it.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'll be embarrassed. But I'll stop doing it.
No, but also when Advara asks you something, you do like this.
It's because I knew she was gonna have a good question.
Hey, but you didn't twirl your hair.
That will be me.
You did look like you wanted to play volleyball.
Did I?
All right, you're among friends here. Okay. All right.
How many slides did you show us? The number?
Yeah, it was. I knew it was too many.
Oh, I had to buy more.
Yeah, I mean, I think 10 slides is probably what you want to aim for.
Yeah.
Okay, taking notes. How to reduce the slide number.
Here.
And also with your question, like you sound incredibly knowledgeable. Like you really sound like the way you answered the questions, you really sounded like you knew your stuff, which is great. You should just go, is there, how are you doing it? Is there a thumb drive? So go to the little folder down at the bottom. Yep.
Great. I need to take my notes.
Yes.
So simple.
Okay. Where is it? Slideshow from beginning. Okay. It looks different on this than it does on my computer.
So for our final presentation at our seminar this afternoon, Dr. Camp is here, and she's going to speak about surgical weight loss via sleeve gastrectomy reverses the tumorigenic effects of obesity. All right, take it away, Dr. Camp.
We have already been introduced, so I will waste no time. This information is a preliminary study that was done in our lab that I'll be presenting the data on today that is influencing my dissertation project. So I did focus very heavily on data. So.
Yeah, it's not working very well. You might use a keyboard.
Oh. So just to orient everyone, obesity causes chronic systemic inflammation and leads to the development of at least 13 different types of cancer, with breast cancer and endometrial cancer being the number 1 and number 4 cancers that are obesity driven. We are interested specifically in breast cancer in our lab because it's the most basal-like breast cancer, because it is the most aggressive and lethal breast cancer subtype. There is epidemiologic data that is conflicting whether weight loss actually protects against cancer progression, breast cancer progression. And it's only been demonstrated that weight loss interventions that typically result in drastic or significant weight loss, such as bariatric surgery, impact breast cancer progression and actually impart an anti-tumor effect. So for this study, we aim to determine the effects of bariatric surgery, which would be a surgical method of weight loss, versus a low-fat diet, a non-surgical method of weight loss, on inflammatory markers, metabolic hormones, adipose tissue remodeling, and tumor burden in our model of breast cancer. I'll quickly go over animal study design. So we had lean and obese C57 black 6 mice, which are a common model that is used for obesity and obesity-related diseases. And mice were either randomized to receive a low-fat or a high-fat diet for 15 weeks. And then a subset of obese mice received a sleeve gastrectomy, which I'll actually go into on the next slide, while all other groups received a sham procedure. And then the mice that received the sleeve gastrectomy were transitioned back to a low-fat diet for obesity reversal. So weight loss happened for 8 weeks after the intervention. And then tumors were injected into the 4th mammary fat pad and allowed to grow for 4 weeks until max tumor limit. Sleeve gastrectomy involves resection of 70% of the stomach, whereas the sham procedure, the incision is made into the abdominal cavity, pressure is applied to the fundus of the stomach, but no actual incision is made, and the stomach remains intact. So results from this study, on the left we have body weight, and you can see over time the control mice remained pretty consistent throughout the study with respect to progression in age. There's a little bit of increase in body weight, but nothing drastic. The DIO mice, or the diet-induced obesity mice, consistently gained a significant amount of weight up through week 16, as did the other two obese groups, so all the other high-fat diet groups. But after surgery, you can see that surgery and diet both returned the body weight back to normal control levels. And you can see this actually visually with the mice on the bottom, where the control mice are on the left, surgery mice second to the left, diet mice third to the left, all maintaining that same lean body mass, and then the diet-induced obesity mice on the right that are overweight consistently throughout the study. So one point I wanted to make here is that we demarcate differences in significance based off of letters. And so you can see here at the top where the body weight is, A represents that there are no differences between groups, where B is significantly different from all other groups. So that will maintain throughout the remainder of the presentation. So here you can see that at tumor endpoint, the surgery group was the same as the control group, but different from the DIO group, and that the formerly obese diet group that did not receive the vertical sleeve gastrectomy was similar to surgery and to the obese mice. But the strongest anti-tumor effect was seen in the sleeve gastrectomy mice. As far as the mammary fat pad adipocyte remodeling, here you can see on the right we have pictures of the adipose tissue, and at the end of the intervention, the obese mice have significantly larger adipocytes and exhibit adipocyte hypertrophy, which is normal for them. The diet mice that did not receive surgery were kind of in an intermediate phase. The surgery treated mice normalized back to the level of lean controls, which was what we expected. And then underneath this, you'll see crown-like structures, which are an indication of macrophage infiltration in adipocytes, and that is secondary to chronic inflammation. We have the DIO mice that have a lot of macrophage accumulation, and actually the surgery mice had the least amount of crown-like structures of any group, even less than the control mice. So as far as our Luminex, when we ran the hormones and inflammatory marker profile, we saw significant differences in insulin-like growth factor, IL-6, which is a cytokine, and TNF-alpha, which is tumor necrosis factor. And these four specifically in the surgery group normalized back to the control levels, whereas diet did not. And this is just showing mammary fat pad gene expression changes. I'm not going to go into the specific metabolic pathways, but on the left, we have inflammatory pathways and cancer pathways that are upregulated in the obese group compared to the compared to the surgery group. And then on the right, we see that there are increases in alterations with adipocyte changes and adipose restructuring in the surgery group compared to the obese group. Microbiome, so we looked at the microbiome at two specific time points, after surgery, pre and post-surgery. At week 15, you can appreciate that the control mice separate very differently from all the other mice, which is what we would expect because the control mice were on a low-fat diet, whereas all the other mice were on a high-fat diet. And then at 25 weeks, we start seeing clustering of all other groups closer to the control mice, except for the DIO, except for there are two outliers at the bottom that we are not sure how that impacts our analysis. The sample size was low, and so we are going to be repeating this with a higher sample size to see if there's a stronger effect. But what we did see is that with the interventions, the surgery treated mice and the diet treated mice both continued to transition back to a lean microbiome. And this was interesting. So on the y-axis, there is an actual taxon of interest. And on the x-axis, we see tumor volume. And so DIO mice are the obese mice. And basically what this graph is showing is that with an increase in tumor volume, we're losing the specific Clostridial species of bacteria. And that may indicate that this bacteria is necessary for an anti-tumor effect. So as far as our conclusions currently and ongoing analyses, we do see that there are benefits from the surgery that are stronger than diet in the adipose tissue, in metabolic hormones, and growth factor signaling, and this may not occur with just chronic diet-induced weight loss. And we do see that there is separation between high-fat diet and low-fat diet in the microbiome, and that there are specific microbiota that may be necessary to produce an anti-tumor effect. I'm currently looking at the liver and lungs as far as metastatic potential and fibrotic potential, to see if there are any differences between the surgery and the diet groups. And additionally, we're also looking at tumor gene expression we're finishing analysis now. Identifying some of the mechanisms by which sleeve gastrectomy is stronger than diet-induced weight loss may help us identify other therapeutic targets for addressing the obesity cancer link.
Thank you.
And other slides, but I these 2 minutes.
Okay.
I know that was a lot, and I flew through.
Do we have some questions for our presenter?
Yes.
Go ahead,
I'm
Chris.
sorry, Rachel.
No, you go ahead.
This is new to me. That's really, I can't believe surgery can have those outcomes. Are there other kinds of surgery, obesity-related surgeries, and are these findings the same in the literature? I don't know if it's been done before. Or is this the only surgery that's used?
So there are multiple different types of bariatric surgery methods. So Roux-en-Y gastric bypass used to be the most common. Now vertical sleeve gastrectomy is the most common, which is one of the reasons why we're doing it in our lab, is because it is the most common. However, there are some conflicting arguments that the Roux-en-Y may have actually stronger effects than the vertical sleeve. However, it's really hard to recapitulate Roux-en-Y in a mouse. It involves completely dissociating the esophagus and the stomach from the duodenum and rearrangement. And so it's just easier to ligate 80% of the stomach, if you can imagine that being easier. So that's the model we're using. But I think that before my PhD is over, we'll probably do a head-to-head of Roux-en-Y and vertical sleeve and look at cancer outcomes and metabolic changes. So
I have a couple of questions. Thank you. Very nice presentation. So you're using breast cancer tumors. Are they going to be the same as other kinds of tumors? Would you expect the same for that exposure be the same? Those tumors to react the same way as another kind of tumor?
Potentially. So the next project we're going to be looking at is endometrial cancer tumors. And we know that obesity increases your risk of endometrial cancer development and progression. And so we would anticipate that with the metabolic renormalization of the surgery, this would have an anti-tumor effect because it has an anti-obesity effect. And so I think that for the potential 13 different cancer types that we know of that that obesity plays a role in potentiation, I would anticipate that this therapy may be effective for at least those that we know of.
Then just to follow up, just about the difference between the bariatric surgery approach that you're using, the sleeve, and a standard weight loss. Is it the volume of weight lost, and if you looked at those two conditions, or the rapidity, the speed with which weight is lost through a bariatric procedure versus someone doing caloric reduction over time?
I think it's both, and that's what we have yet to elucidate. We don't know if it's that acute drop in weight and then the sustained weight loss effect, because it's hard for people even that have the surgery or have a specific surgery, not necessarily vertical sleeve, but up through 2 years, we start seeing reversal of weight because people transition back to their normal eating habits. So we don't know if it's durability, we don't know if it's acuteness. We think it's both, but there's definitely more work to be done.
How do you explain the similarity in the sham and the sleeve findings?
Can we look at it? Okay. As far which.
So you, so the sleeve one is which one is the sham?
So all of the other three,
They're all sham.
they're all sham.
Okay.
So
Okay.
all three of these are sham, and then this is the only sleeve.
Okay, so there's
procedure.
only one sleeve. Okay.
So do you want to know specifically?
Um,
The sham, so basically we have to have a control
yeah.
for the sleeve, and it has to be for all of the other groups. And so they needed the same anesthesia, they needed the same post-operative protocol. That's why we see that reduction immediately at week 17 in body weight, even in the DIO groups, because they received anesthesia, they had a midline abdominal incision, they were on Ensure for 3 days, which is a liquid diet post-operatively. They had a small reduction, but then when they were transitioned back to their high-fat diet, their weight increased again. And we're not showing that there are differences in weight here. Weight's the same between surgery and diet. We're more so interested in why is there a lower effect of tumor volume, and why is there a stronger effect with surgery and with regards to the mammary adipose tissue and the inflammatory cytokines. So more metabolic than actual body fat or lean body mass.
Did you consider to have a group with the VSG and the high fat diet? Because you mentioned like people go back to this unhealthy eating, so maybe.
Yes, so that is my next project. I actually have, I'm specifically interested in what happens if somebody receives a sleeve gastrectomy and then is placed right back on a high-fat diet. Does that same anti-cancer benefit happen? And that's a big question that I think needs to be answered, and so stay tuned.
What do you think? So you said that you thought the changes in Clostridium might be
Protective.
What do you have any idea about what the mechanism might be?
That's very preliminary. I absolutely not. Unfortunately, I don't know what the mechanism is. I don't know.
Interesting though.
I think it's interesting because it could lend to
I'm not.
fecal matter transfers of transferring the specific bacteria into obese individuals, and it may having an anti-cancer effect. I think that's very, very basic, but it lends for additional.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much. All right, let's give Christina some guidance on her presentation.
Sorry. You have a really wonderful slow cadence when you speak that I really want to learn from, because it's really helpful for some of the complex. You had a lot of slides and graphs that I thought were actually useful, and you spoke through them and said this says that in a really helpful way that I never felt lost. But because you have a lot of slides and figures, I felt like, and because you speak well, you kept looking at the slides. And then but I was looking at you because you were speaking well, and then I felt like you weren't really engaging with us.
And it's also a little hard in this, we didn't give you help in this setup because you might have had your slides in front of you.
Right.
But I think this is a good point, but in another situation, you might have had your computer right there and you could been looking down and looking it up and looking down as opposed to having to look up at your side.
And then the last thing is you built up so well, and in the end, the result slide was, well, what next does this mean? And you said it well, but then it was just texty, and I had to read the text while I was listening to what you said and match it up. So I don't know if you can bold text in there or just make fewer points. But
Just circle back and put a bow on it.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, because it built up so well, and I was like, oh, what next does this look? Yeah.
For me, I when you started talking about all the things that you found, I was like, okay, but what were the methods? So I was missing like at least a summary of the methods and the analysis that you did, because you had the design of the study, but you didn't ever mention what you were measuring. So that was for me missing. You did a good job explaining after, but I was like, okay, we're jumping to microbiome now. So I had like to wrap my head over the results.
Yeah, I also since I read your proposal, I knew why you went into microbiome, but it felt really random in your presentation. Like, I think if you had put some background as to why it's important, or why you're interested in it, it would have helped us just feel like it was more of a transition. And then also, I think mentioning somewhere in there that to clarify that this is a preventative and not a treatment option would have been really helpful for the audience. And then just as a minor thing, but when you're showing the graphs with the microbiome data, I think it'd be helpful to mention the type of graph you're showing. So, because there's
Like a PCOA plot.
PCOA, or if it was MDS or
Okay.
NMDS or anything like that, yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't, when you went to the microbiome graphs, I wasn't sure what the Y variable, I didn't know what it was. It's like, what are you measuring?
The bacteria, but yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for me, I thought your figures were really good. Like, they're really good looking figures. But I'm the kind of person where, I guess similar to other people, like, it's, I guess, just figuring out a way to really simply explain the figure is helpful, because there's so many things going on, and not to say, like, they look great, but I think just practicing ways to, like, just simply interpret the figures would help me, just because, I don't know, I'm also not a basic scientist, so.
So one thing that you can do that can really help you in that way is that you can have instead of like at the top where you say, I don't know what you say on the top of your figures, put the words you're actually going to use, like these cluster.
Okay.
Like they cluster along with the experimental condition. Do you know what I mean? Like a statement for what you're trying to show, and then
The illustration
it's
there.
very easy for the viewer to get it. The other thing is that in a lot of your slides, the axes are too small to read, and so it's really hard to see them. And part of that, I think, is because you're holding yourself hostage to this terrible
I know.
background. I mean, it's not terrible, it's beautiful, but it just doesn't give you enough space to play. And so when you have a really complicated figure, you can hide the background and then just blow it up as big as you possibly can.
Okay.
And that's totally fine. Like, it's fine to have some that aren't with the background.
Exactly.
The other thing about the slides, there's one other thing I was going to say, but now I
Well, while you're thinking, maybe this is it, I felt like that there were several times a pointer could have been helpful, because I couldn't follow where on the slide you were, and you can use actually your mouse pointer, if you don't have a clicker pointer. The other thing is I noticed that you did highlight the four plots that you wanted us to look at, but it took me a minute to see, because you kind of highlighted the four. You remember when you were doing your summary and you had little squares around?
The cytokine, the Luinex data.
Right. It'd be a little bit more highlighting that, either putting little arrows just
little arrows that point us, because it took me a while to realize that you had highlighted
For specific
four
ones.
specific ones, because it was
Okay.
just a little bit of highlighting that
Okay.
you
Yeah,
did.
and that did remind me what I was gonna say. Well, two things. One is like when you get to the PCOA ones or anything like that, you can animate circles around different
Exactly.
parts that you wanna
And you
talk
can move
about.
from here to there.
But for the, you told us, I'm gonna show you a bunch of things and then A is gonna be not significant and B is gonna be significant. But you didn't tell us the significant, like P what and multiple comparisons. And then you showed us a C. And then you showed us A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. And I don't know, I didn't know what you were talking about on any of them, because, do you know what I mean?
I see what you're saying.
And so in general, I would just put asterisk and then at the bottom, the test and the significance level. And then it's just super clear. Everybody's used to seeing asterisk because the ABC, A through I was just the different figures.
Steve will not move from that. Like everything he publishes is A,
Well, publishing,
A, B, A, B, C.
no, in a publication, it's fine.
Oh,
when
for presentation
when you
purposes.
present.
Okay.
Yeah. And so if you're going to use, like, I spend an ungodly amount of time on my figures, but if you're going to use some pretty figures from the table that have the A through I on them, I would cover the A through I.
Okay.
And then, draw boxes or do something. You can even, like, I do a lot of white boxes over parts of the figures
Okay.
so that it highlights, I'm going to show you this and I'm going to show you that. You can cut it up and just show the ones that made a difference. Like, you can do a lot of different things to avoid showing
Confusion.
us a
Okay.
bunch of stuff that you're not really talking about.
Yeah, and I was thinking that maybe you could even avoid showing the non-significant ones and just put in text underneath that we examined XYZ as well and it wasn't significant. So that way you're just focusing on the significant.
Thanks, guys.
Anything from our friends
That's it. Julie?
down south?
No, for me
I have
it was
All right.
For me, it was very clear and I really liked the figures and everything. And I just agreed with the transition with the microbiome because it was jumping to another topic. But other than that, for me, it was a really good presentation.
So I have style comments. So you were like totally engaging and smiley before you started the formal presentation and the second it ended. During the actual one, you got to try to like add some of that in. But you started like and I was going to actually say this with you, like when you have your name up, like you are your brand. You are introducing yourself to the scientific community when you do these presentations. So when you get up there, you want your name to be there so that they get another reminder that yes, this is you, name to face. On your introduction slide, you apologize to us. Do not start with an apology. Like you should never be sorry about anything when you're up there. Do you know what I mean? Like I don't even remember what you apologized for, but you apologize.
I think I just said I was already introduced or something.
But
it was to science piece or something.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Very data oriented.
Yeah,
Or something.
yeah.
Yeah, don't do that. Don't
Okay.
tell us like that something bad about your top.
I feel like if you lower the standard.
Well, the standard wasn't low, so.
No.
But you also have your Q&A is really good. You really know your stuff. It's very clear, and you were very patient and good with your questioning. Yeah, so it's great.
Right, this was good. You guys were the guinea pigs on the first day, so the other guys are now schooled, so they'll be able to take advantage of your experiences. Let's take a 15-minute break. Everybody get a breather. You people who've been sweating, let me make this you can, and be sure to get your little USBs and that sort of thing. And we'll start back at 3:15 and we'll spend about an hour on these outlines. Okay? All right, be ready. Guess what? You don't have any homework. How's that? Aren't we good?
It's relative though.
But
you know.
You know what's ahead. I'm going to caution you because of that.
Yeah.
All right.
Hey, Natalia, can you move the camera so I'm looking at the table and not the wall?
Hang on. That would be better, wouldn't it?
No, it's a nice wall.
I'm kind of out of my skill set here, Julie, so let me know if I get this right.
Well done.
Is that it?
It is.
All right.
Thank you.
Are you in Cape Town?
We're about 2.5 hours outside of Cape Town.
Not that I know much besides I can say Cape Town. That's about probably what I know in terms of my geography. Role change for John.
Mm-mm.
What's he doing?
Wait, what?
So he said, give him a role change. I'm wondering who might make more sense to be
Oh,
like you for these
He
departmental.
just has, he takes care of Epi now and he has some reduction
he's
in
got-
effort here because of the
They've
new
merged to.
thing, the new whatever, administrative student services
Oh
thing.
my gosh. This place is going to hell in a handbasket. Could you believe all that confusion on these presentations?
Yeah.
And then the fact that Steve Mercer sends me his take on it, and that just,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know.
yeah. I'm really adjusted. He's not even over there. I was going to speak to him.
Hey, how's everything going with your stuff?
Just incredibly busy. It's absolutely ridiculous. And
How many grad students do you have?
I only have one in nutrition, but I have a lot in bios and epi that I'm serving as an advisor to, which is great. Good Lord.
When is your project? When is like the?
Oh, the do or die day this Thursday. I know. I'm so scared.
What do you, is it flow?
Yeah, I'll be doing all the B cell subsets on the adipose tissue after the Resolve One injection, so we'll see.
Do you use Beck's flow machine or do you use the?
I use the attune with the core. Yeah. And I'm learning how to transition to the LSR2 right now. Because the attune it's really good, like you can fit, like I'd say comfortably, like up to 7 to 8 markers, but the LSR2 obviously can go up to like 14. So we'll see, because if it works, then I will go up to like 12 markers or so. If it's a total bust, I don't know what I'm gonna do with my life, but we'll figure that out. Yeah.
You know, your comment at the end of the Q&A or the discussion of Christina's, I was going to ask that question because I was like, are you doing this for treating cancer patients better? And that's the thing. And I really kept getting, and I think I'm the least informed probably of anybody in the room, but if you are in a group, I think you really need to somehow write that. So why are we doing this? Because I kept thinking, is it because people who have cancer, we want them to, have surgery or get serious weight loss, and then they're doing treatment. I was trying to put those two together.
Yeah, and if you're gonna target like a specific population that have a genetic screen or something, that would be helpful to say. Like, I don't know this type of cancer, what type of population gets it, but if there is an early detection period that you would use to kind of capture these people,
To get water.
that would be helpful. Is there?
Yeah, I think it's more of like. Thank you.
Oh, great, thank you.
I'm gonna put my file on.
You're a woman
Yes, do.
who's premenopausal. Your grandfather, grandmother had breast cancer. Like, you need to lose weight. Weight loss. This would decrease your risk by 40%.
Yeah, I think that would be great to say in the beginning. That kind of scenario, like she's at risk. This is her risk percentage. This is why. That's clear in your proposal. Yeah.
I focused on the data too much in the presentation, but.
Are we all back in the land of work? Okay, I'm gonna stand.
Yeah.
Where are we starting?
Oh, I was going to, let me find my little cheat sheet. I meant to do this a while ago. La, 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 la,
Give it to
me.
I can borrow your mine.
You sure?
Okay. So why don't we start in the middle? We'll start in the middle, but we'll give Christina a break. She could go either way, but so Daria is the first proposal. And Julie and Natalia.
I'm opening.
So I've got it open so I can go.
And Daria, you made that fatal flaw. You uploaded something called preliminary studies outline. Instead of the whole grade, you mean? You need your name on file.
I'm sorry.
Julie, do you want to start?
Sure. So I just had a few comments. For under your 1A, if you could include the ends for like how many you've actually collected and processed and stored, that would just give your reader a better idea of, is it 5 people we're talking about, or is it 10, and is this a scalable study or not? So just including that would be more information for your reader to judge the quality of this proposal. And for point 2, you say data from other investigation teams. I'm assuming you mean independent labs, but if you're meaning collaborators, just make sure that's clear. I think both could be important to have in your proposal. It's just a matter of making sure it's clear for your reader.
Thank
I think those are my two major comments.
Yes, I also have like a similar.
It's disconcerting. I can't see her. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I kept looking for us, Julie. I wanted to find her little face.
It is too late. So I also said that you can mention the number of samples, and maybe like something about your participants too, if you already have some measurements like nutritional status or glycemic control, because you mentioned that is important in your proposal. Same as the comment of Julie, if like these other investigative teams are like collaborators or not. And yes, and the third one I was confused about the composite. Like, I didn't understand what it means or like what how you were going to create it. But
Okay.
yeah, that's my 3 comments.
Is it generally frowned upon to use the data of people who are not your collaborators as preliminary?
Well, that's not preliminary studies.
Okay.
Several people did that. That's,
I actually had a question about that.
you may use, obviously when you're setting the stage, you're developing your significance, you're building on the work of others. But in your prelim studies, it's you, your group, your team, and what you have done and are demonstrating what you are able to do. He says, I think you're not in the room, but Steve said that hers was.
Yeah, so I think that's true, except in like a rare case where like you have, your group has done the mice, your group has done the this and the that, and there's one step that you guys haven't done, but it's a well-established. To tell that story of the entire experiment, you could plug somebody else's work in if it's like a validated thing. That's an important step, just to tie the whole thing together.
Yes, unless there's some need for you to demonstrate you can do that.
Right.
If it has a unique, kind of whatever, or you could say following the work of, Jones and Smith, we will blah, 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 that sort of thing. But
So if our group hasn't done most of these things, then
well, I'm probably not going to fund you.
uh-huh. Well-
That's the thing is that if I can't, we can't feel, now if this is our small 2-year grant, that sort of thing, you sometimes can get by with that. Penny, I don't know what you would say about this. I'd just say that the funding people are just not going to do it. But you've done other things. The thing is that your group has done a lot of stuff with the population.
Yeah, just not really related to microbiome.
But Ian is like one of your collaborators,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
So
Ian's
you
part of
could
your team.
include His
Yeah, his data though is in people with anorexia, so it's not the
Well,
same
it
population.
depends what you're trying to say.
Right.
Because, if he can collect fecal samples from a population.
Right.
He can collect fecal samples.
Mhm.
Like that means that you are gonna borrow
Access.
his methods, his kits, like all of that expertise
Mhm.
that is already there.
Mhm.
So you can say it, as in, also a clinically, a subset of clinical people. Like there's no reason why necessarily that the anorexics would be more or less likely to provide fecal samples. Do you know what I mean? So so it would work.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I don't know where that's coming from.
I think that might
I think
be
it's an
Julie.
RI.
I don't know.
Sound like a dog.
Or it is NRS.
The door is open, so people can.
I don't know.
And so like for the purposes of this proposal, is it okay, I think we've kind of talked about this, but is it okay to make things up?
For the purpose of the proposal, I think it's
Yeah.
okay.
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 I mean, what we want you to do is we want you to be able to show us authentically that you can handle the project.
Okay.
And so if you don't have a figure on, like I think you didn't really, your preliminary didn't really address a lot of what you're actually going to do.
Right.
So like for mediation, you may not have done it or published a mediation study, but you could create something to fill that gap.
I might make another suggestion. So you've got your dissertation ideas, and we're saying we want you to school yourself in writing the RO1 because we want you to have that expertise upon graduation. So think now that you're not just following your advisor here. This is you, and you can draw on that as part of your team. If you need to add another team member, that's what I would do is say, maybe Dr. Gordon Larson's work, she's part of your team. Again, we know that that's not, true. You're invoking people who, may have not agreed to do that, but this is just in a theoretical. That's what I would do. And that way that you're, instead of making up something, you're using something that exists, but someone who would be a natural collaborator with you.
Okay. That's helpful, thank you.
So I'm going to go back to enrollment. So when you say that your ability to recruit will provide a sufficient sample, so part of your sufficient sample is going to be your power analysis in your methods. But part of what you're trying to say here is, that you are able to recruit. But the problem is that recruiting is not the end of your problem. Because you have to be able to recruit them. You have to be able to recruit more than you need because you're going to lose some in lost follow-up because it's really rare to keep a full lost to follow-up, sample. So you got to enroll more than you need for that. And not everybody agrees to provide fecal samples. So there's some data that you can use to give a percent of people you expect. So you are going to have data from somewhere out there, published papers or whatever, for kind of lost to follow-up in type 1 diabetics, and the number who usually agree in a population study or clinic study to provide fecal samples. And so all of those are going to have to be much bigger than the sample that you are looking at for your power analyses, because you don't even need to enroll more people because you can't. It's going to be like 85% will give you fecal samples and you expect to lose maybe another 15%. So, you just got to do the math and get the numbers taken away.
And a lot of that is taken, you put that in your power calculation section of the approach. And it could be, this is the thing that becomes the art and the science of preliminary studies. And some of you, I think it was Chris, maybe you were IDing where you were going to put your, or maybe it was you, but if in that power calc section of the analysis, you then go back to some preliminary study where you got how, what you're going to use to calculate the effect size, from your, prior studies or something like that. So that may be another place where you use your prior work, or it may be that you're getting it from somewhere else. But that would be in the power calc section, which would be in the analysis section. I think that's where I would put it.
The approach section.
The analysis, we're going to talk about approach pretty soon, but if you think about it, it's really sort of you sort of restate your purpose again, and then you start doing your methods about what data you're going to collect and blah, 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 that sort of thing. And then the analytic part is how you're going to analyze it, which would include your power calculation.
So,
that's where I would put it.
Okay.
Power calculation.
Because I know we also talked about power calculations getting put in prelim studies. So does it?
I've never seen that in prelim studies.
It depends how you're doing your preliminary, because some people actually put their preliminary in their methods. So typically the power comes at the very end of each AIM methods. So you show us what you're going to do, and then you say, I'm going to have power for it. But there's sometimes people can do a preliminary studies that ties into the aims. So this is this art thing. It just depends where it flows.
It is. There's no right or wrong. It's just really what makes sense.
Okay.
So I feel like your entire section 2 goes into significance, what you have here in this outline.
Yeah.
And you need to have the preliminary data for all 3 of your aims. So what does the distribution look like for intake, for glycemia, for adiposity? And then what about your data showing the association between the exposures and the outcomes? And then can you show us the methods that you can successfully test mediation? And then the other thing is that you mentioned a composite variable. Well, you don't have a composite variable in your aims. So why are you telling me it now? Do you know what I mean?
I thought I did. Maybe I didn't call it a composite variable.
Yes, you need to use the same language
Mhm.
all the way through. And for that composite variable, you'll really want to provide some information that it's a valid marker of whatever you're planning to do.
All right, shall we go on? All right, where's my little... Let's go up rather than down. Let's go to Julie. In another continent. And that was Daria, you're on stage again, and Christopher.
I can go next to give Daria a little break. The first thing, I don't have the answer for this, but that first section about the suitability of the team, I don't know if there's a section that goes in that when you put the bio sketches or something else, or if it actually goes in the body. But it did, so I don't know where that would go, but that's the comment. Because if it has to go in, then the way it's written or the way it's outlined, I don't know if it would fit, because it's not necessarily about the research. I really like the second bullet point on prior nutrition work. It reinforces in particular why you're looking at the modification from nutrition specifically. So definitely I would put that in the significant section. The next section, the pilot study, that one is a little more difficult to place because on one hand it is significance related, but it does seem to demonstrate your proficiency in carrying out the method, so that could also go in approach. I don't know if you're allowed to put things in both places, but that would be good. And then the recruitment feasibility, that was well written and nice. I'll put that in approach. And then the last one about the prior SEM models, I didn't know if you meant prior, like it has been done before, therefore it will work here, or if you specifically have done it. But if the latter, then I like that a lot.
Okay, so this isn't really related to like whether this belongs here in preliminary studies, but you have in the section, the second section where the header is prior nutrition work. There's the second bullet talks about a pilot study where micronutrient supplementation was effective, and it kind of made me think, well, if we already know it's effective, then why do we need to do the study again? But I think probably scaling it up is important. So I guess just making sure to emphasize what your work adds. Also, similar to someone else's comment, I just thought it would be good to, mention whether some of these prelim studies are coming from your group or from other people's groups. And then in the power calculation section, you have in the first bullet something that says multiple correlations. And I wasn't really sure what that meant. I wasn't sure if you meant to say R squared, or if you were saying that it was multiple comparisons, and if it was the second one, were you going to adjust for multiple comparisons? In that second bullet under power calculation, you have the phrase 3 factors, and I don't think you're doing any sort of factor analysis, so I also wasn't sure what that meant. Let's see. And then I just had a couple of editorial comments for you that you can see. Yeah, and I think that's all I had.
How do you comment? I just made some comments, Julie, just about the pilot study, and I assume that you're comparing women who consume alcohol with those who don't, if there are such a group of those who don't.
Correct.
I'm not sure how extensive the problem is. And I had to look up dysmorphologist to see what a dysmorphology person was, but I found out. I also thought, I don't know that whether my conclusion is right or not, but it looked like the paragraph on recruitment feasibility, that there had been a good bit of work done. And I'm just wondering if you could, sometimes I aggregate all that wonderful recruitment that I've done, and it sort of makes a dramatic impression. I've recruited over, 800 children and families into blah, blah, blah. It sort of gives a potency that you've an old hand at doing that, even though you've certainly had it in the different components. I just thought you might could leverage that a little bit. And again, I wasn't sure if the power calculation was based on your data, and if so, it would go as part of the power calculation section, or if not, it goes as part of the power calculation section, but without any reference to your group. That's it for me. Sending it to you. All right. Coming. All right. Barbara. That would be Christina and Daria, right?
Yes.
Let Christina go, just
Yep.
since Daria's
Go
had
first.
center stage. Well, you have two of them, really.
So I think you can read my 4 comments, but one of the questions I had was, I was a little confused when I was reviewing. I thought that it was supposed to be your preliminary data. And so I highlighted the things that it says my flow, our lab.
Yeah, I think I just wasn't clear on that. All of this is mine, except for
Okay.
the parts that I say Nishimura paper and Charles Sirhan paper.
Okay.
So 95% of it's mine. Which I actually was wondering, for the Nishimura paper, I think I can just reference it in text and not show any of their actual results. But for the Resolve Anyone improvements of adiponectin 2D, it's a pretty important piece that we show that the adipokines are changed with Resolve Anyone, but I don't personally have that, so.
Well, she said you could potentially
just
say
pretend
following
like
the work
we're-
of X.
Yeah. So,
Or in line with the work of X.
so can I just do what you were saying, where I just, could I just reference it, or should I say that this person could be a collaborator or something?
Well, I think obviously you don't have, if you need to show the reviewer that you are able to do something, then you need to somehow do that. If it's an
It's an easy, well-known method, so it's not anything that I have to prove that we know how to do, because every wet lab knows
Yeah,
how to
so-
measure these.
so you don't need, but if it is
But it's key for the question then. So you have to, I guess I'm asking is, if Resolvin E1 doesn't affect the adipokines or adipose tissue inflammatory profile, then this whole thing is pointless. So we know though that to be a fact because countless studies have done it and showed it. So can I just say that countless studies have shown it? Or
yeah,
do
I don't think you have to make those people part of your group. I mean, it's sort of common knowledge, it's shown. But you're going to do something different. You're going to use this exploitation to do something else with it, right?
Well, this
But a lot-
established.
If it's well established, that should also be in your significance.
Yeah, exactly.
So it should really, that should be a big part.
Yeah,
of
Right
that.
in there.
And then if you want to refer back to that very briefly to make a point, then that would be okay.
Okay.
And when I refer to other places in the manuscript, I mean, in the proposal, I'll refer back, to whatever B.6 or, whatever.
And 2A, I thought it was relevant. I didn't know if, it says my analysis, so yeah, I think you should definitely include that.
I mean, we try to really establish our strength within this area that we're working. And so we take every opportunity to sort of reference what we've done that sort of that's building toward this. If it was something I did over, I don't do that, but it's, I won't miss an opportunity to try to cite paper that we did this and we saw this and we were the first group to do, to create this method or whatever.
Do you think people might ask, well, if you saw this effect in EPA, why aren't you doing an EPA study instead of a Resolve Anyone study? So I do have a response to that, but should I address that response? Or do you think that question would come up, or maybe just I'm overthinking my stuff?
I think it's actually a good segue because people know what EPA is.
Okay.
Like, I know what EPA is. I did not, not a lot of people know what Resolve Anyone is. And so if you're talking about EPA, and they can be like, they think of fish oil, they think, okay, like that's kind of where this is going.
Yeah, but there's a big negative connotation around fish oil supplements and fish oil studies.
Yeah, I know, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah,
People can hang on to EPA.
I don't know how to answer it because I don't quite know the field. I don't know, Penny, you have a thought about it? Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, I think you have the right. I'm trying to open your thing. My computer apparently is having a hard time. Like all of my things and I have EndNote code, so I'm like trying to figure out if I can open the document and actually look at it, because your document now is like 60 pages long, full of EndNote codes. So I can't. I'm trying to. That's why I keep like logging in and logging out and doing other things. So I can't look at it and effectively advise you. But I feel like you were on the right track in terms of understanding formulaically what you need to show to establish the fact that you can get from point A to point B. Like you seem to know. And so it's just a question now of moving some of the stuff that's there to the significance, honing in on the exact steps that you want to show that your lab can do. So I think you've got the right idea.
Okay.
I can't look at it to give you specifics right now.
It's okay. Yeah, I'll just include it and explain.
But I mean, that's really impressive that all of that is yours.
Yeah, it certainly is.
Yeah. Yeah, I was also really impressed that you've done all of this background work. I thought that you might run into space issues, and so then you'll have to be really selective with what you actually want to show visually using figures and versus what you just want to have a line about. The first section I thought maybe could be split out. I'm not really sure how you're planning on introducing it, but I think it might be a little bit, I mean, the person will have read the first part of your proposal, so they'll already be familiar, but I think having B-cell SNPs and adipose all in one section might be a little bit much unless you can
No,
figure out a way to kind of like.
I'm gonna break it apart.
Okay.
It's just for this.
And you also use the term B-cell subsets. I'm not entirely sure what that means, and I didn't really see it explained fully in the proposal, so I thought maybe that could be something you.
I think it's more about, more acknowledging it. But so I mentioned it in the significance and aims, but basically there's only a handful and I measure all of them. So that's what I mean by that. But I don't know how diverse the study sections are. I'm not sure.
Yeah, they might know. I'm not sure. Okay, another comment on 2A. You might have said it in the proposal, but if you haven't, it might be good to explain why you're using figure out this comment. What's your measure of adiposity? Do you have a measure of adiposity?
Not in humans.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't really understand this comment. I might have gone off the rails with that.
I just, for the NHANES data, I just basically did everybody who had a BMI above 30 for males and females, and then I took the tertiles of EPA intake, just mathematically, and then looked at their oral glucose tolerance test measures. And then it shows like a stark decrease the more they take of EPA.
Yeah, and I guess just one other thing, because you have so much great data, I guess just figuring out the right order to present it in to, promote the logical flow so that it's easier for the reader to follow. And last comment is, I wasn't sure, and I could totally be wrong here, but I wasn't sure whether, I think it was F was entirely necessary, because I wasn't sure that it related directly to the proposal, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, it's an aim.
Okay.
It's okay.
Sorry.
No, it's fine.
I think I got confused by the DO because.
Oh, DO versus DIO. Yeah, it's the diversity of red mice. So it's the genetics component of my aim.
Like the cross collaborative.
Yeah, they're the parents. They're the children of the cross collaborative
Gotcha.
mice. Yes.
But that does have the potential to confuse people.
Yeah, that's why I don't use DIO.
Oh, you aren't using it?
No, I just say diet-induced obese. I just say the whole thing because I'm gonna use DO a lot more.
Yeah. That's good.
Was that for me? Great, thanks.
All right, anything, anybody? Okay, let's do the ESIS proposal. Aurora, Christina.
So my first comment would be that it would be important to specify the preliminary data that is yours versus your collaborators versus other researchers, because I wasn't sure. I was like, that's a lot of
That's mine.
preliminary data and
all.
very, very thorough.
She said it's all hers.
Yeah,
That's
that's
all
mine.
yours. Okay, so then, I said, assuming that most of this data is yours, then it may be worth mentioning like sample acquisition or how you have access to the samples. And maybe mentioning or highlighting the most relevant main findings or conclusions or takeaway points, because there is so much preliminary data. And maybe considering adding a summary at the end, just something that kind of puts a bow on, out of all of that data, what are you using to move forward with? I don't know. That's kind of my thought.
Thank you.
So I agree with Christina in that it's really thorough. It's just really good, and it has a lot of information, but it could also confuse the reader potentially. So I think going back to that point of trying to choose exactly what you need to show, like I wasn't sure for a mere 129.5 prime, were you trying, so you're saying misregulation in breast cancer, and I wasn't really sure how relevant that was to your work. It might be relevant, but if things like that aren't directly tied, or you can just reference it or explain it in words, I think you don't have to necessarily show it. And then also in the bottom, when you say differential regulation of microRNAs by sex, you don't really mention sex differences at all in your aims from what I remember. So is it necessary to include?
Yes, that was actually something new that I found with my new array, that I found differences, and now I'm fixing the rest to talk about sex differences, because I just realized that my liver data is separated by sex, and I didn't know that before. But that's a really good point.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, so basically my main takeaway from this was that it's really thorough, and it's impressive that you have all that data, which is great. But again, just be careful to not lose anybody in the minutia, because I think you can easily do that. So if you somehow present it in a way that, I know it's difficult with all this type of data, but if you could just cut it to exactly what you need to show, and then if there are two things that show the same trends, you could just say likewise smear XYZ shows the same trend as this other one, something like that. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you.
I agree with what Aurora was saying. I think it's a little hard because the way the outline is written, you just have the list of things. So you just want to be sure that when you are presenting each piece that you walk through the analysis and say, I need this because of whatever, you know? So in the writing of it, just being very explicit about how each contributes to solve the whole.
Okay, moving on. Natalia. That would be Christopher and Isis.
Okay. The general thing I'll say is, and I don't know if it's because I was unclear if the data were yours, but I didn't know if it was preliminary studies. A lot of it seemed in service of building the need and less so the
So is
approach.
ours.
Okay, so that's the first point. The second point being, it seems to be in service of building the need, so like the prevalence of overweight and obesity, you know, and I think it can go really well. But then by the end of it, I was like this section, the changes in sugar content of packaged food section, that seems really directly relevant to what you're saying you're going to do here. And so it struck me as a very, that there was a lot of, our prior work has shown in a descriptive way this need, and then, but sections like this, I think would be really powerful to say, we've done the pre and post, we've done some of that. So I think, and I know you've done that. So I think fleshing that out a bit more would be really helpful. For the counterfactual, right? That section, the last section, the changes in purchases, those sections. And then you have the comments and the.
Yeah. Thank you.
For me, Natalia, again, it was really complicated to see. I mean, it looks really organized, and that you have information. I think it will be really interesting to see with the prevalence of overweight and obesity, that data, what results are going to give you if you have more preliminary results from that. But other than that, I don't have other comments.
Yeah, I know there's been a good bit of work done in Chile, and I don't know how involved or whether you can stretch your group, you know, because there's obviously you've got to be affiliated with all the Chilean work that's being done. So I think it's really, you know, I think you have a nice story. In other words, we're doing this, and we're doing this, and we're doing this, and we've seen reformulation, we're seeing people change. But now, was there this unintended consequence? And we need to, because we need to know that, to know, you know, whether there could be potential for risk, even though there's, it's hard to define what the risk is for this thing. But when we're talking about little children, you want to be overcautious about, even if you're not clear about what the risk identified. But I think making sure that you're claiming, because this work seems like it has built from one to that sort of thing. So you're building a storyline.
Yes.
I was not sure why you opened with the prevalence of overweight and obesity because it's not part of your,
It's not my aim.
right.
Right.
And then, the baseline diet consumption seems really clear to me. But then the next several sections, it makes me concerned because it looks like you've already done some of the stuff that you are proposing to do.
No.
I know, but it just, you want to be,
Okay.
I mean, I understand that it's not based on the aims, but I think that reader reading quickly will miss that. And so you want to make sure as you write it, I mean, it's fine for the outline, but as you write it, just be sensitive to the fact, just like Diane said, we know from prior work, but we're taking the next step to do blah, blah, blah. Just be really clear with it.
Okay.
I think you should, in your narratives that you've written in the past, have talked about the increase in artificial sweeteners
Yes.
that are now in the formulation. Isn't that right? And
So,
where's that data coming from?
so I analyzed the trends of the purchases of the non-caloric sweeteners, and the reformulation comes from they check consumption. They check the packaged foods that they have been taking pictures constantly from the supermarkets, and they compare how the same product has been changing. And then, based on that, they see how the distribution of the sugar has been shifting to the left, actually. But we don't know anything about the low calorie sweeteners. We know that the sugar is reducing, but they haven't checked what's going on with the packages low caloric sweetener. And I am the first one that is analyzing what is going on there with the beverages in the purchases.
But you still need to show us that you can get the LCS out of the packaged food.
Yeah, so that's why I'm using it for the purchases, because I linked the information from the packages.
I think what I'm saying is that I think you want a little bit more on the method for how you did that, because you're the first person to do it. You want to make sure that it makes sense.
And do you think that should be here or in the approach?
There.
Well,
Because you're not proposing to develop it, you're proposing to use it,
Okay.
right?
And I would encourage you all to consider the natural location of these preliminary studies. Right now, you've sort of made an outline that looks like you're going to dump it all in the front. That may be fine, like the preamble almost to your approach section. But think about that. This is the art of it all. It can go in the significance, it can go in innovation, and it can go in approach. It just depends on where it's most appropriate.
That's very true, but you do run the risk if you don't have it in its own little box in one spot that a reviewer will say,
Where's the preliminary study?
so, just if you move it to other places, just use the word preliminary studies, even though it sounds awkward, just underline, make it really clear so that your reviewer, when they look to see, they just easily can see that you've got it to be able to do. I mean, you will be shocked when you get your first reviews where you will have people read your thing where you have clearly said, I am going to do X. And they say, they did not say they were going to do X. And so you just have to be completely, ridiculously clear if you do anything other than a little section. I mean, it's really about everything, but just be really clear. Yeah.
Is it acceptable to have a preliminary study section and then something akin to we expound in more detail in such and such, or is it no referencing within the document?
So what I would do for Natalia's in this case is that I would personally say, we've developed this nifty method to do LCS in this preliminary studies, and then I would I wouldn't talk about the mechanics for how to use it, but then when I get down to the method, I would say using our method, well-established method, and then I'd say C.3, because that's what preliminary studies is usually, and then, in bold, in parentheses. So then it's clear to the person that, yeah, she already told me what she was gonna do. That's how I do it. Because I think it's very hard and unnatural sometimes, because what you have in the preliminary is often something you're using in the methods, and so it is really hard and it's awkward, and so you have to figure out the right flow. I've seen it work beautifully where they don't, there's no preliminary study section, but then in each they kind of have a preliminary study, like, here's what I'm going to do, here's the hypotheses I'm going to test, here in my preliminary studies are the tools I'm going to use, here are my methods for doing the analysis, here's my power, and all of that just in a row for each aim, and it looks beautiful, but it just depends. It totally depends on how, like, it works. That works really well for basic science proposals. Doesn't always work as well for observational, but it can. You just have to figure it out.
Well, I think my guess, my assumption from what I know about the work in Chile is there's such a story that's already been told, and you're part of that. And so I think, that your preliminary study is probably a really natural preliminary study section.
Yes.
There may be places where you revisit that in methodology and that sort of thing, but you have such a good story of the work that's preceded. I think so. Okay. Closing in on it. Come back to me. Come. Chris, you come back. Okay. Christopher's.
Julie, do you want to start or should I start?
You can start.
Okay. So when you talk about the preliminary data and findings, well, you have all my comments. I was like, when you mentioned like the data that you collected data on food environments and health, I will be more specific on which type of data. And also, since you have a lot of focus on the dual burden, I think you're missing preliminary findings. I think I don't know if that's one outcome or one exposure, because I didn't read the whole proposal again, but maybe explain like how much of the people that you have has a dual burden. Then you already measured like the anemia, you already measured a lot of stuff. So maybe you can do a summary table of like saying like these my population, and they have this and this and this. Also, when you say that the study was adequately powered to, like, I know that maybe goes later in the approach, but like show how it was calculated. Then you talk about the NEMS market data. Again, explain what it is. This market data, because the acronym and like the quality, and again, how then you have like high and low environment score, like what is high, what is low, how is this defined, and maybe give more information about the market stores. I didn't understand the equation when I was reading it, but I understand better after you presented, but maybe try to put what you said in here. And yes, I think those are my main comments. Well, and you also have a lot of published work, but yeah, I think that will be a significance, but not a preliminary study.
Which one? The last section?
And the last section.
They're all in press. None of them are.
Oh, they are not published yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then I had similar feedback as Natalia did regarding expanding some of the sections you had written in your outline, such as defining how it was adequately powered. You say that I just have to believe you without any more explanation, so feel free to write that out a little bit more. I agree with the formula comment. It was somewhat off-putting in the text and needs more explanation if you're going to keep it in there. The paragraph before that, you say your group is the first one that conceptualized access. I think that needs more explanation if you're the first group that did that, but I'm sure you could include that in your outline. Nitpicky thing, but for tables and figures, you're allowed to have smaller font size, but there still is a certain number of characters per inch rule per NIH. Just make sure you're compliant with that. Currently, I think your table 1 probably doesn't meet the rule for it. Keep an eye on that. Other than that, I think my other comments are pretty minor, and they're in the written feedback that you have.
I think when I went through this, I was unaware until your presentation of the affiliation with the Michigan State guy.
The who, sorry?
Michigan State, because I didn't recognize these references, and I was trying to figure out who on the team, as opposed to whether this was your team's data or whether you were just
I'm
using,
puzzled. I don't work with anybody from Michigan State. You talking about Paul Villamata?
yeah,
He's here.
He's here.
Oh.
Yeah. But he was for his
maybe it was,
doctoral work, so maybe that's.
anyway, I was looking at the
Okay.
people on the references that you had, 55 and 56, is that right? Just, but he's part of this group, right?
Mm-hmm.
Eliminate that.
So I have comments. I think that table that you have, the key measures, is something you would want in the approach methods section. You do have always, when you are building on, and Daria, you have this issue too, when you're building on an existing study, you really want to be clear. Like I usually will have a table that's like key measures I'm going to use in the study, and then 2 columns, 1 already funded, 1 proposed for funding, and then just put like checks going down. So it's like super clear to the reviewer that you're not double dipping and that you are bringing something unique to this already existing study so that they view it as a strength and not a weakness. So I would rework that key measures one that way. I also felt like you need to do a little bit more about the the R21 data, because your R21 talked about 550 residents, and then your study has more than that, and so it's just really unclear what the numbers were, and so you want to make sure that all of the numbers match throughout the entire document. You really want in your preliminary data to set the stage that motivates the 2 aims. So you want to show us the quality, the access and quality relative to the maps, and the fact that you can do this, but not just that you can do the method, but the meaning of the method. I feel like you keep talking about the method just as a method, and you need to do a little bit more tying it to the interpretation and the meaning and the why it's important. I have this in, like, I'll send you this, but you also want to show the data that prompt you to propose that there's something here that is related to compensatory food purchasing habits, like what led you to propose that, and then can you validly create the archetypes that you're proposing, or that, if there was some background information that shows that you can actually create those things, that you can create all of your proposed measures, your diet patterns, your DQS, DDS, food environment, food purchasing behaviors, and health indicators, and that you have data that actually point to independent and joint effects. So all of that, you really want to be able to point to what's building on the relationships you're testing, not just that you can do the method, but what's leading you to ask these questions. I find it easy to sort of say so-and-so, or in our earlier work, we found this, that left a huge gap. Here I propose to fill the gap. It's sort of the kind of chain of the discussion that you can have around the preliminary studies that works well. I also just was struck when you presented today, the fact that you said that you can walk across the island in 40 minutes. And that actually led me while we were sitting here to think, if you can walk across the island in 40 minutes, then you can get to any store anywhere. So why are you looking at it in this environment? There's got to be a reason. And there's, I'm sure, a lot of rationale, but don't let somebody read it and think that. You know what I mean? You need to really articulate why.
Yeah.
And so a question for a lot of those things, it would flow well if it would go in an approach section, because then I can make that table, or I can talk about those things and how we're conceptualizing and accounting for transportation and those things. But then that loses the ability to have it all in one section. I'm still struggling with how best to.
So what you want to do is in all of the preliminary data, you want to show that you can do the work and that there's reason to be asking the questions you're asking. And so you want, it's more of a, it's less of a report and more of a, this is proof that I'm capable and my data are capable, both me and my data are capable of doing what I'm proposing. And so it's really not the section that you typically would give a ton of data on how you would do it. So I would put the how, like if it's a method, like this spatial method would work perfectly in the method section. Like you don't need to do preliminary data on that, except if you want to say, we have successfully used a spatial interpolation to publish X number of papers, period. That's it.
And then on to the next.
Yeah.
Okay. And then is that the thing where you're saying C3, you would reference that you mentioned it? Okay. Okay, thank you.
I also, and maybe this is implicit in your bullets, but I kept wanting to know what in that R21 data you found.
In terms of the finding this.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, like stuff from the, I was looking for stuff.
Yeah, that's all the motivating stuff that I think is missing.
Yeah, it's just, I mean,
motivating
it's like you've got a plan, but there's stuff that's preceded, and I want to know what you found, because that's what's making this important. And
just so we know, what is the R21? Like, what does she propose to do in that?
Looking at household food security scales, and the markets was kind of added on, but it was more dual burden with psychological distress, testing the mediation of psychological distress on dual burden outcomes.
So she just created the environment data just to deal with that question.
The environment data being the market data? Mm-hmm. No, that was an add-on that was kind of, we added on because food environments is kind of what I was.
So it's not funded in the R21?
The market surveys are in part, and then also in part by some other smaller grants that I had gotten and some undergrads had gotten, but I think it was vague. It was in the original proposal where it was, we will look at environmental things, and it was such as market things. But so I believe the original impetus was to gather, but then we fleshed it out a bit more with surveys, things like that. I believe. I don't know what her mind said.
And so you're not, in this grant, you're not proposing to, because I guess the other question is that, like, what you're proposing here is really in your aims, you really are only proposing analytical aims, and it would be pretty rare. Like this reads more like a F31 or a R21 than a RO1, and so you might want to actually add that as a kind of a phony aim to generate that data.
Like a large data collection endeavor. Interesting.
Yeah, because I don't know that you could get this funded as an RO1 with just the analysis and not some sort of creation.
Yeah, when the original drafts, that was the aim, was we're going to gather the data. But then I couldn't think of the hypothesis. Yeah.
And then it becomes, I think, easier for you to write all of this part about the method, because you're generating the data and using this well-established method to actually create these surfaces. So it's not, you would be pretending like that wasn't done. I mean, you have the same problem that Daria has, because you guys both have other grants that you're kind of working with, and it makes what you're proposing here smaller than an R01. And so you just have to, you've got to figure out ways to beef it up. And Daria's been working on beefing hers up for the past couple of times, but this just first hit me this time with yours.
And then you're saying write it as if the R21 never existed?
No, I'm
Okay.
saying rate it as the R21 was what the R21 is.
Right.
And they
Next
proposed
steps.
a couple of little environment things,
Mhm.
or maybe none of the environment things, and then you are gonna generate all of that environment data.
You may be writing Amanda's next grant,
Yeah.
because that's what the R21 is designed to do, is
Right.
build for the next. I'm sure it must be me, Christopher, because you can tell by some of the questions I ask about just the geospatial stuff. But I just felt like this sentence, this preliminary work is significant for two main reasons. It leverages the robust geospatial methods. Okay, which can convert point data to continuous surfaces. Okay. While accounting for the inherent diminishing importance of local food environments with distance. But you're still not talking about distance from anybody's house.
We can talk more, because that's not, I think in public health, that tends to be the only dimension of distance, because public health is about the health, and you have an automatic outcome. But when we're thinking of an actual, just a map, when we think of a map, the distance doesn't have to have a reference. Distance is a general concept relating to like covariance over space. Distance is just a generic term to say how, on average, how do these two variables, their relationship change over distance. So it's more in that term. I think it's a field specific thing, but I do have to find a better way to articulate.
But if you're going to the NIH, maybe you're not, maybe you're going to NSF, but NIH is looking for it related to health.
Yeah, and that's why there's aims 2 and sub 8 and 2A. But in terms of aim 1, which is what this is, this part is supposed to say, hey, look, we can do aim 1 in a larger scale. There's, I don't know, a way around saying the word distance without some sort of household reference, but I'll figure out a way to explain that better.
I think it would work better if you just said you were creating a surface layer
Okay.
and then described it.
For the approach, even without even going deeper in.
Well, I just think it's a hard thing. I mean, unless you can look at the way that Paul and others have described the method. Because there's the nuts and bolts description, which is a lot of what you have here, but then there's a bigger description for the theoretical and practical application that I think is missing. And so I think you just need some of that theory and application detail to fill in you've got the big part in the middle, the mechanics of doing it.
All right, let's do some resetting where we are, because next week we have 4 presentations, no homework. So what is it that you guys should be doing and should have been doing all along?
We didn't do Christina's.
We did.
Then we did.
Oh, I just lost my memory.
Yeah. I also was confused and asked her.
We should.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't do use. Did I not? Yeah, I thought I did you. Yeah.
Oh, no, it's wrong. Sorry.
We should be writing the preliminary
Making me
data
doubt
section
myself.
and the methods.
Yeah, but yes. But the other thing that I am concerned that maybe is not happening, and maybe because we're taking, just get the job, the assignment done. But you've been getting feedback from a lot of sources. Some, is better than others, but you've been getting a lot of feedback discussions. You need to be making modifications to your proposal. So it shouldn't look the same. Last week's application shouldn't look the same as this. And sometimes they did. I couldn't see any differences. So make sure you're taking advantage. This is great feedback. This is what you get, obviously, collectively. This is what you get when you submit and get rejected. You get a review. So here, you're getting a review without rejection. So you're really getting feedback, which is really wonderful to get. And again, you balance it out. Somebody said something and somebody else said something contradictory, but you just, you take that and you think, all right, what's my best judgment about which of these is the best idea? And so be sure that you're taking advantage of that. And if I were you, I mean, I think the next assignment is actually you're supposed to write the narrative around this preliminary study section.
Yeah, but this is all small.
This is really
stuff, and
small.
you're going to get slammed with methods.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the more that you can perfect every single thing that you've
Yeah.
done before,
Yeah.
so that when it comes time to the methods, that's all you need to focus on. That's going to do yourself a huge favor.
And as you come into contact with things that are have implications for methods, then you put them somewhere that you can get to them. And as you think of, gosh, that needs to go in my methods section, I want to be sure I make notes. So you're sort of keeping notes and keeping track of that. But I just want to encourage you to sort of stay with this, even though it looks like we've got a nice break.
And also, and I know it's frustrating to get the aims. I mean, I continue, when you guys send them to me, I'm reading them from the beginning to whatever stage we're at. And I continue to give you feedback on your aims. And I know it's annoying, but it's, that is how I do it. Like, that's how, like, I rewrite my aims. I will spend, I think of a grant as a baby. It's a 9-month thing for me. And I spend a good 5 months on those aims, writing and rewriting. And I've never tracked how many revisions I do. But somebody just recently posted that on Twitter. Did you see that? Because we're Twitter buddies, so we see the same stuff. But he posted a figure because you can do it in Google Docs, and that's how he wrote it. And he showed this, it was a huge amount of time and versions for getting it to where it was, and then a very abbreviated time for the rest. So, I apologize for making you feel bad in one sense, because I know it's no fun. But on the other hand, I'm happy that you guys are engaging and allowing that feedback, because it's rough. I can also tell you I run the faculty specific aims review for Gillings, and we do the same exact thing. I mean, we had somebody, there were like 2 or 3 people for whom we completely rewrote their aims. I mean, we have them doing different
They may
things.
not be much better than you,
and it's
at this
yeah,
stage,
I mean,
really.
it's just like it's awful, in terms of the fact that you feel really good about something and then you get knocked down again. You feel really good and then you get knocked down again. But you just have to try not to feel the knockdown, and instead reframe it more as making it better and making progress. It's just something that is an inherent process of writing a grant.
And it's like, think about this, that a comment or critique or review means something. You can say, oh, they just didn't know what they were talking about. Well, you need to first start with, maybe I didn't make it clear that what this was. So you have to get past, because when you get a review back, it's like, how could they be so stupid? But then you just put it away, and then you bring it back out when you've had a little bit of time, and then you start picking it apart and finding, and you go, yeah, that was really good. That was something I thought I had it, but I didn't. So sometimes you may have to put them down, but really your feedback will help you craft a better narrative. Better aims get clearer, aims get, sharper.
And if there's something we keep picking at, like we keep saying, this doesn't make sense, or this, rewrite this, or why do you have this aim, or, whatever, that's often a clue that it's not necessarily that it's a bad idea. It's just we don't know what you're meaning.
Right.
So don't abandon an idea just because we don't understand it. Reframe it, you know. But if you keep getting the same kind of feedback, that's often what it is just we don't understand it. And so just help us to understand it.
I'm trying to get ahead on something, and I didn't write this down on the first step class. I think I know everyone's advisor. I'm gonna try to get, when we start with the approach section, try to get you all a little bit more comfortable. Is this with papers that you might be assigned to review. Who's your advisor?
Dr. Shea, Rod Shea.
Okay.
Roz, Beth,
Yeah, I got Beth.
Peggy.
Well, it's
Kirsten.
actually Amanda, isn't it?
Mm-mm.
That's,
Both.
okay.
Kirsting, Lindsay,
Yeah,
Mhm.
and Julie, who's yours?
Linda, and
Phil and I.
Phil, and Isis is Steve.
Okay. Okay, all righty, got that. And anything else? We've got 5 more minutes. Anything from you? Anything?
I
you
have one question, but
Okay.
I was a little bit confused last week when I was checking the syllabus, and it was a part talking about background and discussing background, and not for this class, but I guess I had the wrong idea, and I just want to have this clear. That background section is just for the specific aims. There's not per se a background section. That's now what we call preliminary studies.
Background is significance.
Background is
It's like basically,
okay.
it's basically everything that's before your methods. I think it used to be called background.
Yeah, I think sometime maybe our
Yeah, that's
terminology
why.
might
That's why I'm
Sorry about
confused,
that.
because I was checking other grants and then it was this not clear, and for me it was confusing. I was waiting for the background section, and I guess that's why my significance is lacking of a lot of information, because I was waiting for background section. And I made some comments to you guys. I'm sorry about that, because I was saying, this can be good for background. This can be good for background. But I was confused.
Our fault. Yeah, I think that we've got remnants of things that we've been teaching it for. I've been teaching it for almost 20 years now. So I think there's some remnants in there, but thanks for pointing that out. I need to go in and work with, we got good help with Jenna helping us, but try to get rid of that. It's only significance,
Okay.
Innovation, background section, which is preliminary studies, and it's really all that's in approach. So it's significance and innovation and approach are really the header sections.
Okay, sounds good. Thank
Sorry
you.
about that. Okay. Anything else, Julie? Anything from you? I can't see your face.
Nothing from me.
Okay.
I had a quick question. Like Christina mentioned and somebody else mentioned in their preliminary studies, like the qualifications someone has for doing the.
I think that's in
Yeah, do you put that usually in the
your
grant?
team.
Like
I
your-
think it's a
okay.
preference of what people do. I've seen it, a lot of different people. You have to put in bio sketches.
Do you just put it in?
Yeah, you should try, your bio sketch can have, and your justification kind of things can have some of that, mostly that it goes in the bio sketch. But if you've got the world's expert in whatever, you should say in the grant, I have the world's expert in whatever, because that really helps. But otherwise, or if so-and-so is a leader in this methodology, or, has developed this unique method, then I think you can do it. But I wouldn't spend a lot of time, because they're going to look in the bio sketches when they do the investigator section. They'll look there, and then they'll look in the justification to see what people are doing, and it's kind of the combination between those two that gets them.
What is bio sketches?
The bio sketches are do we even do bio sketches here? So it's the the federal grants have these, they're bio sketches that are like sort of an
Okay.
abbreviated
CV.
resume.
Yeah.
And so they usually start with a little paragraph that gives an overview of who you are, and then it says why you're kind of like why you're on the project. Like I'm on this project to, as an obesity specialist, and so I'm, in the context of this project, I'm providing leadership in the selection of the methods we use, the interpretation of the obesity measures, blah 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 blah, and then there's a little like my perspective on the field, and then you have like 4 or 5 areas of excellence, and then you have a little paragraph about why you're an expert in each of those. I think there are 4 things, and then you pick selected publications for each of those 4, and then at the end you have a link to all of your publications. So you want to be thinking, kind of, it's good to start developing them, but it's really hard as a junior person because you're just starting. You don't have necessarily a ton of expertise that you can say, I've published papers in each of these things yet. But you do want to start thinking about, it's important to think when you're thinking about the papers you want to write, what do you want on that bio sketch? What do you ultimately want to be able to say that you're an expert in? So you're an expert in, some sort of method, and you write these methodological papers. You're a really expert in cancer biology, and you've written these papers. You're an expert in clinic-based studies, and so you've written these papers, kind of like that.
Previous grants go in there as well. Like
The grants, yeah, there's there's usually like a other support section that's kind of does that says where you're being funded, but it's very abbreviated on the bio sketch, and you don't go that far back like on the other support. It's usually very, very much current because they're more concerned with what your funding sources are at that moment in time. But we can put bio sketch up on the, we can put some of them up on the web to look at on Sakai.
Okay. We filled another 3
Diane
hours.
was worried.
Huh?
Were you worried about today?
I was. Well, I didn't want to have time that we didn't have valuable activities to do. Not that I need you to sit here for 3 hours, but if we were finished an hour early and I went, oh, well, let's just stop today. And then I worried that we'd lose all this time that we could do other things.
I think this was really good because typically I think the reason you were worried is because typically we have more people, like last year we had more people in the class.
Right.
And so when people gave their presentations, we didn't have a lot of time. Like we were just like, here's the problems.
That's right.
Here's 1, 2, 3 problems.
Then get off.
Here's your thing. So this time we had more leisurely, deeper kind of comments because we just spent more time, which I think is a very wonderful opportunity.
So next Monday, we will have 4. So I will be thinking about what we're going to do. Make sure that we take advantage of having a good class.
Are the recordings going to be on Sakai?
Apparently. I guess so. That's the way we have to do them now. We used to bring the camera. This is the first time we've ever done this.
No, we
Guess we gotta do it again if we didn't.
We always brought a camera in and we had all sorts of production and apparently I got feedback from the journal that I didn't, somehow didn't get to me and revisions were due.
What you said? Nothing's due Friday.
Oh, no.
A day
No,
ago.
nothing.
Today.
Nothing.
First
No,
time.
I got a feed that
No.
just came in my mailbox.
My biggest question is in
No.
the beginning, I was struggling with it because the example I was using
And
was
that this section is going to be
Dr.
brutal
Zazel's
for me.
that proposed data collections, the biomarker panel
Thank
was
you.
the hypothesis for this work. With the assumption that it would based on the prior research, but I don't know what a testable hypothesis would be. for data collection.
That you can create